Pew-pew-pew.
Okay, so...
Hey, look, we're live.
Yeah.
Great success.
Hey, look, we're live.
Great success.
Excellent. Excellent and good news.
Cool. So, being that we are now live, thanks to everyone who's in the chat that's been incredibly patient, waiting for us to get our difficulties under control. And also thanks to all of our panelists who have shown up and also been patient whilst we figured this out. I'll go ahead and introduce myself, and then we'll just do a quick round of introductions as well. My name's Desney. I am the writer and director of The Hobbit's Hoedown. I've been LARPing for about 5 years or so, give or take. And I set this thing up so that we could all be collaborative and thoughtful game designers, and maybe use this isolation time to think about writing games and the types of games that we want to play, and think about the types of games that we want to see in the world. That's me.
Yeah.
Next.
I can go next. Yeah, so I'm Hayden. I've done organizing for The Hobbit's Hoedown and have had input in a whole variety of other projects. And yeah, I've got a long history of playing LARP and doing stuff on the organizational side and stuff like that. So that's, yeah, sort of my background.
Hi, I'm Joe. I've been LARPing for 20 odd years now, and I've been involved in designing and running LARPs, a bunch of LARPs, including most notably probably Zeppelin and Watchers of Easthaven. And I am looking forward to chatting about game design.
I'll go next. My name's Rick, and most recently and most relevant to this particular panel, I was one of the admins at the Warsong LARP in Brisbane, and my admin role was Game Mechanics Officer. So hopefully I know what I'm talking about. But prior to that, yeah, as a player, I've got just under 10 years experience, and then game design and tabletop and all the rest of it just around the periphery from there, and storyteller at a few parlor type LARPs as well.
Hey, I'm Matt. I am one half of the admin team for Quorum Purim, which is a Vampire the Masquerade LARP. In terms of everyone else, I think I'm pretty green. I've only been LARPing about 4 years, but I've been involved in tabletop gaming for forever. Played a lot of competitive card games. I was a judge for Magic the Gathering in Australia. I did my Masters of Education with a focus on gamification in education. So I've got a pretty strong grasp on game mechanics and rules writing, and incorporating that into everyday gaming and life, I guess.
I know we're doing introductions right now, but I'm just like, hey, we should do a stream about games and education sometime soon.
Yeah, okay, I'll write that down. I guess that also can flow into games being used as art as well. So, I mean, I'm happy to talk about that all day. I'll do that all day.
Absolutely.
Cool. So, what is a game mechanic? Does someone want to give an answer?
I am happy to start on that one. So, the way, and I mean, this might be different to the way other people sort of see it, but to me, a game mechanic is a piece of, it's basically a structure or limitation within your play space that is sort of agreed to by everyone involved in that play space that sort of alters the mode of interaction between players. And sort of, for me, the easiest way I look at this is, as a kid, I used to play a lot of games with my friends where we'd run around with sticks hitting each other, basically amounted to LARP, but those games had no rules and mechanics. And then once we all started playing D&D, we started then introducing mechanics into those sort of live action things we do, and those essentially became added elements of structure or limitations in what we were already doing to sort of alter the way we interacted with one another within that play space. And so, yeah, I think that's sort of the easiest way to look at the mechanic from like a very broad level. In terms of more specific, you've got sort of mechanics that sort of judge how players interact with each other and how if you have sort of like a structure of organizers or GMs, how those people interact with the players. So like inter-player interactions and interactions between players and the external parts of the play space that are not the players themselves.
I think just off the back of that, I know one of the things that we're probably going to talk about in a bit of detail as a group is sort of the difference between rules and mechanics.
Yes.
And I think for me, the word mechanics, and again, one of the great things about these panels, if you haven't already seen the first couple, I've definitely been watching along, is we get to see everyone's own perspectives from our filters of experience. And most recently, before I got into LARP, I was very much in the video game programming and design space. So when I think rules, I think more in that sort of sports space. The rules are how you define the objectives of the game, what you can and can't do. There's a very clear structure about what rules are in relation to games and sports and that sort of thing. Mechanics, particularly with LARP, for me, are more about those rules that support and shape the fiction. So whereas your rules are almost what you are and aren't allowed to do, your mechanics are how you can have a rule set that actually supports fictional physics or science, or like what are the actual truths of the setting that you're playing in, and how can you either restrict players from breaking them in a way their characters wouldn't be able to do, or how can you support your players to be able to simulate the things that they can't actually do in reality.
I would say that I definitely, coming off of what Rick just said, I definitely feel that there is a difference that I differentiate for when I write personally, in which that like my rules are kind of more of a structured thing of like what you can and can't do, and the I guess the mechanics are more of like a thing where I guess the outcome of what those rules then sort of have come up to the surface, and the way in which, as you were saying, that you support the world that you've created.
Yeah, I think of rules as a subset of mechanics, rules are what you tell people that they have to do, or the things that all of your players are abiding by and playing by, and the mechanics are the systems that make the game work. So if you say, here, the rules are that if you hit someone with a sword, they take 1 hit point of damage, and if you lose 3 hit points, then you die, and you're allowed to parry in these ways, and you're allowed to hit people in these places, then those things sort of make a combat mechanic that happens together, right? So I think of rules as sort of the individual components of bigger game mechanics. I think it is one of those things that is open to debate and discussion. And honestly, I tend to use the terms interchangeably, which is not great academia, but I mean, I'm not a great academic.
That's okay. I don't think any of us are academics. However, we are trying to express some pretty almost really kind of liquid stuff with as much articulation as possible, which is why I think we need the language in order to have like a shared glossary of terms so that we all are kind of understanding where we're coming from. So that's completely fine. Matt, we haven't heard from you. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I would say your mechanics really are your flavor. They're what facilitate your players' ability to interact with your rules and your world. So, for example, like as Rick was saying, in a video game, walking is a mechanic, running is a mechanic, and there's different flavors of movement. The rules would say you can go within these squares, these boundaries, and the mechanics are, well, here's how you can do that. You can walk, you can run, you can jump, you can somersault if you want. Those are your flavor. So that's how I differentiate it. I think in terms of really good game design, your rules should be almost invisible and your mechanics should be very, very visible. Be the way I differentiate them.
That was a great answer. Cool. Well, the second question that we were supposed to get onto was the difference between rule and mechanic. But I think we've kind of covered that. Being that said, how do game mechanics affect the roleplay of character?
Oh, that's yeah. So I would say probably the biggest one here is again sort of going back to the point of like sort of the mechanics that you put into a play space, are sort of there to change or limit the way players can interact with each other for both better and worse. So by definition, anything you introduce to the play space that alters the way people interact with each other is going to alter how they role play with one another, like just by definition. Because if you have like literally a space that says bring players in, we're all going to interact with each other, there's as little structure as possible, everyone's improvising, no one has been given any information prior, and then you sort of go off that. Like that's sort of like the most bare bones structure you could take for a play space, but even then there are sort of, it's likely that mechanics will develop throughout the course of that. So I think probably the big ones are anything you do is going to alter the way players role play with one another. I think probably the biggest one for me in terms of that is there is a point of diminishing returns, which is the more rules you add to a game and the more players have to remember in the moment of playing, the less neural load they're going to have to do role playing, which I've seen happen in a few games, very, very rules heavy games. But again, that's only in my experience. And, there are sort of some mechanics that are designed to encourage players to interact with each other that as sort of like they're designed to force moments of conflict or interaction that wouldn't otherwise happen that are sort of driving that forward. So in relation to like, how do mechanics affect roleplay, it's like in any way that you want, basically. It's just about trying it or using things that are tried and tested and, seeing if you can apply them to your game, because it's like any mechanic you introduce is going to affect the way players interact, and anything that affects the way players interact is going to affect roleplay, which is players interacting but in character. Yeah, I don't know. It's Yeah. Someone might have a more specific answer than I do.
Yeah, well, I think that the specific answer is in every way, right? Like, if your setting almost functions as a mechanic and a rule, in that, and that is one of the key bases to making character. I think that every mechanic will, many mechanics will affect the way people play their characters. If you put in a mechanic that says you're not allowed to run in our combat game, then that means that people who don't like running, or characters, will change the way they play around it, and characters who don't like running will become more interesting, and characters who wear very little stuff so they can run fast become a lot less interesting, and so people will play less of them. I think my favorite example of good game design mechanics affecting role playing is from the tabletop game Burning Wheel. And in the Burning Wheel, you have many skills. It's a deep and complex game with a lot of mental load, and it takes time to gain the system mastery to get through that load into character play. But in that game, you have many different conversational skills you can use. Like, ugly truth is different to persuasion, is different to rhetoric, is different to negotiation, is different to religious diatribe. And if you want to roll the skill you're good at, then you need to make a speech with the skill you're using. So you roleplay your character and you change the way you talk to use the skills you're good at. And so you're reinforced in talking the way your character would by getting to roll more dice. Whereas if you talk in a way that's not how your character is, then you roll less dice.
Well, I think on that point as well, there's something to be said about, because I know sort of within the culture we're in the Victorian/Australian LARP scene, there's a tendency for more mechanic light or rules light, especially games, to be seen as also being more roleplay heavy, because it's sort of like, in a situation where you have a lot of different interconnecting rules and mechanics that the sort of, in most situations, the players who are going to thrive most in an environment like that are the ones who are able to puzzle out the interactions between those things and build sort of like the best possible character. And there is an overlap. There is very little overlap between players who are very good at that and players who really, really enjoy role playing and storytelling and are there mostly just to do sort of the fluffy stuff. But on the flip side, and this is sort of like a running joke with a lot of Australian LARPers who, take great delight in dunking on American LARPs, is a lot of the American LARP stuff I've read is like so mechanics heavy, so rules heavy. Their rule books are incredibly dense. There's like one I looked at, it's like about 12 types of damage, and they're in a hierarchy, and you've got different defense types. And I could not imagine playing something like that and being able to roleplay. But it's also like very clear from a lot of those players that like the story and role playing elements are like massive. So for them, and as you just mentioned, like this introduction of like more and more rules and interconnected systems is something that's encouraging role play in that space. Whereas like in Victoria and sort of Australia generally, it's like it's generally seen as like the less moving parts the rule system has, the better it will be for role playing. Which I think is interesting because I don't know if that's necessarily true the world over.
I think there's also there's a similar movement in tabletop roleplay at the moment, or at least over the last few years as well, where moving from I think it's more about change than there being one right answer. But traditional role-playing systems have always been very, very rules and mechanics heavy, a whole lot of calculation and everything going on. So sort of the more recent generations of games that are more freeform or systemless or hybrid or whatever you want to call it, it feels like as a player, if you view rules and mechanics as things that are there to restrict you, the less of those there are, the more. It doesn't necessarily mean that there'll be more role play, because that's always going to be player driven. But as a player, you feel like you can role play any character you want and do whatever you want, because there's not as much stuff telling you that you can't do it. Joe?
Yeah, I think there's a key point there where it's like the mechanics. I think mechanics that just tell you can't do stuff are not great, and I think we worry a bit too much about that. Whereas I think what we should be thinking about is, how do our mechanics encourage the gameplay we want to see? So in Masks, which is a teenage superheroes game, you gain experience when you fail rolls. And so, or Mouse Guard, which is another one of these Burning Wheel ones, where it's like, this system wants you to go outside your comfort zone and try things that you're not good at. And so you get points for that. And so that makes people do it. Or a LARP example would be what's it called? Black Powder and Bloodlines, where there is a bunch of you starve and die if you don't have food. And that mechanic exists to make people go and interact with the game, right? There are a bunch of storage boxes out in the woods that you can go and explore and find. There's a bunch of other things. But the key, there is a driving mechanic there that says you must eat food, you must have one of these tokens at the end of the game or you die. And that mechanic doesn't really restrict, I mean, it does restrict your roleplay a bit, because, you know, you've got to do stuff. But what it really does is it encourages the kind of gameplay that the designers want to see. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I think one of the key things that I picked up from that in particular is the idea of the mechanic specifically being designed to encourage something. And I think that's, no matter what genre you're in, no matter how many rules or mechanics you want, no matter how you view your system, the most important thing you can do self-critically and feedbacking collaborators when you're writing a system and looking at mechanics is making sure that all your rules and mechanics actually have a purpose. And actually look at does the original purpose line up with the reality of how that's playing out? Because the no plan survives contact with the enemy is also a no game design looks the same before and after playtesting, and that goes for LARP doubly so. If you have a rule in there just because it's a rule that you think is cool, try to go a little bit deeper with it. Like, what is cool about it? Is it because of the way that it balances combat? Is it because of the way that it encourages a particular type of roleplay? Is it to stop something that would otherwise be game breaking and take spotlight away from something that you want the game to be about? Like, why does that rule exist? And any system that has rules really needs that sort of design element and justification for what the rules are for, and ideally that development cycle where you can come back around and actually, either with player feedback or with a review board or however you want to structure it, is the rule actually working the way that we want it to? And if not, is it still giving us enough value to keep in, or should we tweak it? Should we get rid of it? Should we change it?
Just coming off of what Rick was saying, I think that one of the things that you can definitely think about when you are trying to come from a viewpoint of why does this like rule or mechanic exist is I mean, there's no higher purpose in any game than play. Like, there is literally no higher purpose. And so one of the things that you might think about is, how will my players feel? Like, what do I want my players to experience? And coming from that, you can sort of ask, I mean, from looking at your mixing desk, looking at like the genre of the game that you wish to design, you can sort of think to yourself, what is it that my players are going to, I want that my players to get out of it? Like, what do I want them to feel? What do I want them to relate to? And even if it is like as something as simple as like, I want my players to feel cool, then like, or I want my players to feel warm and fuzzy, like those mechanics can be then still written with some kind of thought to the emotion of your players.
Well, I think as well, something that touches on what got mentioned here is sort of what Joe is talking about is Black Powder and Bloodlines introduced a failure state. So if you didn't get food, you had failed the game, you die. And having that failure state means that players need to go out and interact with the world in order to not fail. And, you know, some games also have success states as well. You know, most games incorporate both a failure and a success state, but not everyone does. And success states are also a way to sort of encourage players to go out into the world, interact with it and other players in order to succeed. And because in that way, I would say that sort of the Hobbit's Hoedown didn't really have a success state so much, because sort of playing and taking part in the game, that was it. Like, that was the whole point, was to have fun. If you were playing, you were having fun. But there was a failure state.
I would actually say that was the success state.
Yeah. So it's like, but if there was a sort of distinct failure state, which is like, if you come to this game and then try to compete with the other players, or don't interact, or don't take part in the activities, or, you know, don't enjoy yourself, that's sort of like a failure state. But those are like very, very broad.
Just on that quickly, Hayden, just from because I was purely there as a player. I didn't obviously see behind the curtain as much as you guys did. But for me, my impression of the success and failure states of Hobbit's Hoedown, based on the way the mechanics were phrased, was that the success was actually, did the other people around you have fun? And the failure is that you didn't help other people have fun. So not finding fun yourself was actually irrelevant to the design and the focus of, like, as a player, obviously you can only control your own input and your actions, but I very much felt that from day one at that event, the rules as they were very much about how can I get more people involved and how can I make other people enjoy it.
Yeah.
And then the success state was as simple as, did everyone have fun?
Well, because that's predicated on the assumption that if you are helping other people have a good time and they're doing the same thing, you're going to have a better time than if you're trying to have a good time at the expense of other people. Which is sort of like, so the failure state basically boiled down to, are you playing this competitively? Because if you are, you're going to lose.
I just want to put one thing in there that says, I don't think dying in Black Powder is a fail. I think being uninteresting in Black Powder is a fail. And I think that the game is written such that you can die and still succeed at playing the game. I would be interested to hear, because this is very much a gamification discussion, I would be interested to hear how that works for you, Matt.
Yeah, so one of the things I always think about when I'm designing my mechanics is all my rules, I like to frame them as a question. And I think a good question is both open-ended but well scaffolded. So like I kind of want to disagree with something you said earlier, where negative or restrictive mechanics are bad. And I think I disagree with that because I personally feel that creativity comes from restriction. And so, like, one of the best games, and I read an article on this at the beginning of the year. One of the best games that I played last year was a tabletop game called Bonanza. And if you look at the rule set of that game, every single rule was a restrictive rule. There was nothing like you can do this. It was you cannot do this. You must do this in this order. As a card game, you can't shuffle your cards. As a Magic the Gathering player, that sucked because I shuffle like crazy. But it was the most fun I've had playing a card game in a long time, and it was incredibly restrictive.
Yeah,
but I had to find creative ways to get around that, which is where the fun came from.
Sorry, yeah, I might have misspoken. What I meant was that thinking of mechanics in terms of only restrictive mechanics is bad. So
yeah.
Sorry, go on.
So what was I saying? I like to phrase it as a question, and your answer is your player response. So you're going to get a whole bunch of different players at your game. Some of them are going to be competitive. Some of them are going to be incredibly casual. Some of them are going to have no fucking idea what they're doing. And realistically, the best way to approach that is to design to the edges, to design to each one of those players and then try to keep it balanced rather than designing to an average. One of the best things I ever saw in terms of design was actually an education video called The Myth of Average. And they talk about the US Air Force designing cockpits for fighter pilots. But what they realized, and I can link this in the chat if you want, but one of the things that they realized was like every pilot had a jagged profile in terms of their stats. Just because they're the tallest person doesn't mean they have the longest torso or the widest shoulders or the longest legs. And they discovered that they were designing these cockpits to fit the average pilot, which meant that they were literally designing the cockpit for no one.
Yeah, well, I think that's like sort of just on that thing of averages. It's like this idea of the bell curve as well was created as a model because people assumed that's what people would fall into. Like, intellect is the main one from like school scores, but like, there are lots of ways that people are like, oh yeah, the humans fit into a bell curve, but it's like, probably actually humans don't fit into a bell curve, but because the bell curve assumption was created before data collection started, and then the data that was collected was then made to fit the bell curve. There's a lot of this kind of, as you mentioned, like this falsehood of average that gets applied to things where it probably doesn't exist.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think that idea of designing to the edges is a really interesting one. Because you can also sort of take it in the other direction where instead of, like, rather than designing for your average player or rather than trying to design, keeping in like a broad spectrum of players, you can also design for a very specific subset of players. Like design a game that like only a handful of people are going to enjoy, but like those people are going to have a really good time with it. And I think that's fine so long as, you are, and as we're sort of going back to controlling expectations, as long as people know that that's what's happening. If you're like, hey, this is a game, you want to come to a LARP where there's basically no roleplay, but like, the rule system's designed for you to abuse the hell out of it and make the most powerful thing you can do, and like, you're all going to have a bad time competing with each other, and I know there are like 25 players in the state who love that. That's fine, but you've got to open up your, control expectations for that, because if you have someone who comes to that being like, oh, I've got this really cool character, I want to role play, like, I'm going to have these like cool role play interactions, it's like, you're going to have a terrible time in this game.
Yeah. Sorry, Josiah's just linked the player types, the Bartle taxonomy of player types in the chat. And as a Magic player, Matt will be familiar with another set of player types with Spike and whoever the other guy is.
Timmy and Johnny.
Johnny?
Yeah, Johnny and Timmy.
Yeah, there we go. When we were writing Zeppelin, we essentially took that taxonomy and rewrote it for us and said, we're writing our game for detectives and for for detectives and for archaeologists and for socialites, and I've forgotten what the fourth one was, but we wrote, and then we would design our games for those 4 people. Soldiers was the fourth one. And those 4 people obviously didn't exist. There was no player that was any one of those things, or who was just any one of those things. But if we made interesting games if we made sure that a player who wanted to go and play the inspector game, that was there. The player who wanted to go and play the soldier game, that was there. And then players dipped in and out of those games as they wanted to.
Yeah. We went with the G6 that happened, I want to say like 2 years ago now.
Too long.
Too long, yeah. So we went through the audience of a LARP game, which in game types, I believe it was the Emergenist, Explorer or Detective, the gamers or playing to win types, and the people who are looking for the narrative. I mean, I definitely tried to take all of those people into consideration when I was writing The Hobbit's Hoedown, but more of in a sense of like, hi, actually, the standard that we want everyone to meet is like over here, and like all of you have such varying different types of like of where you are in your costuming, in where you are in like your cooking abilities, or your courageousness in social situations, or even like how much risk, like how much what do you call it, outgoingness that you have or willingness to participate in role play. And so we recognize that all these different types of players from coming from different types of LARPs have had these different, like, wildly varying sort of skills and gaps in their LARP experiences. So we tried as much as possible to be able to cheerlead everyone to coming to the actual event, to come to a place in which it was a little bit more cohesive and together, so that it didn't feel so like fragmented apart from each other, so that our community felt like the culture of the mechanic, or the mechanic of culture, was a little bit more homogenous. And I mean, as we know, players will often set their own win conditions, but we were pretty firm in telling everyone that we really wanted them to concentrate on the supporting of everyone else. And I mean, it became that was like a rule and also a mechanic. And I mean, it means that the cool thing about that sort of stuff, it does influence the overall culture of your player base and the trust that they have in each other as players. So I think that's also something that you can definitely keep in mind when you're starting to think about these things. What effect is it going to have on the culture of your player base?
Is this where we shift into specific mechanics?
I just have one thing that I'd like to touch on first.
Yes.
It's come up as sort of a theme in a lot of the things that we've said, but hasn't been explicitly stated yet, and that's the idea of the meta and players that play to win and min-maxing and that sort of stuff.
Yes.
And we've sort of acknowledged that you want to try to figure out if there are any of those sort of min-max exploits in your game, and then if so, are you happy with them being there and being used by those players, or is it something that you need to try to counterbalance? But definitely one of the things when you are looking at your rules is that there will always be a subset of your player base that looks for the meta and the best way to play and the most efficient way to win. Contrary to a lot of people that I have written and run LARPs and stories with, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I don't think that that's a wrong player type. But making sure that those players are able to have as much fun and that fun doesn't come at the expense of other people. So when you're talking about role play, do the mechanics that allow for the most efficient win condition type player also make sense in setting as a character choice and as role play? And does that conflict map to in-character conflict, or is it just like Munchkin type players and you get that salt in the community about it?
Well,
if you're looking at changing rules,
That's a really good point.
Are you actually going to be changing the meta of the game with those rules? And if you've got an existing player base, are you then going to actually be shifting expectations without communicating that and upsetting a lot of people with the fact that how it affects roleplay is if you've written a character so that your role played in character is, I'm a very competitive fighter, I've trained all my life to be able to do it. Specifically, I fight with a two-handed sword, and I've always fought in the front lines of all my battles, and I wear heavy armor, and blah, 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 blah. They've done the right thing to make that part of their character so that there's not a Rick wants to win, so I'm wearing extra armor, but my character is actually like a shirtless barbarian from a village. I just wear the armor so I can live longer. No, it's a character decision. I'm justifying it. It's fine. Now there's a rule change that says you can't have both two-handed weapons and heavy armor. The game designers have made a choice that's actually made me have to either retcon my character or in between sessions I have to go, okay, so in character, why have I decided to stop wearing the breastplate? Or in character, why have I changed to a shorter sword?
Well, sort of. Yeah, something I want to touch on with those players specifically, as speaking as one of them, is that so when you're the kind of person who wants to use every tool they have within the game to win the game, that's, I agree. I think that's fine. I think because it's sort of, if you're saying that there are explorer, narrative focused players, immersion focused players, and then victory through whatever means focused players, players who are playing to win, it's sort of usually that their interests often don't align with the interests of your other player types. Generally, again, that's not universally the case. But I think it's mostly a problem when a game is set up in such a way that playing to win and playing a good character within the world of the game are different things. Because I know, sort of going to my own experience in Swordcraft, when I was like at my worst in that regard, like, I was being ruthless and cutthroat and trying to, win using whatever tools I had. Even though I went out of my, there were several limitations I imposed upon myself for no real reason. It was sort of a point of pride. But I designed a character who was basically just a ruthless fascist, because it's like, I was like, cool, that makes sense. That makes the way I'm playing make sense. But that sucked for everyone around me. That sucked for the people I played with. That sucked for the people I played against. It sucked for me because, the way the world was set up, and the way I was playing, it didn't work. And it's like, I don't want to do that again in that kind of game. But again, I do like those hyper-competitive games. It's just like, those games need to be designed for that purpose, and that purpose explicitly. And I'm not saying that those games can't include other player types, but if you want a game where you want those sort of win-at-any-cost players playing, you need to have designed with that outcome in mind, because otherwise you're going to run into problems where those characters, because those kinds of players will always preference winning over character integrity, and then you get problems where they violate their characters' integrity in order to win, and that makes other people unhappy.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And the key takeaway for me there is, when you're designing your game, make sure that the most competitive way to play, or the most effective and efficient and powerful way to play, is also the way that you want people to play.
And also in line with the world if you want roleplay to be a part of it. Like, it has to
Correct.
also jive with roleplay.
Yes.
Like...
So, and a good example is War Machine is a tabletop role-playing game in which you want, you have your armies, you paint miniatures, blah, 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 blah. And they have a system called Theme Forces where you get a bunch of extra power if you build your army in a way that works with the story of the game. So, like, specific... setting-based, time-specific forces, you're like, if you take this sort of stuff and limit yourself to these things, you get extra power. And so what you get is highly thematic armies, which is what the game, which works for the people who play for the story and the people who play for the diorama of it. And also the competitive people get to be like, look at all this power I get out of building a cool diorama.
I think with those hyper-competitive players, carrot-based mechanics is the way to go, because, like, if you strip the competitive one all the way back to sport, so the rules in sport are given to all the players and the teams, and then they go away and they train and they specifically design the way that they are going to perform on how to win, because it's the only purpose in the game. They're not making character decisions in the heat of the moment as to, like, this would be the most effective play, but is it right for me? No, you do it. But they still run into the same issues where it's, if someone's now playing rules as written versus rules as intended, if you actually have to have referees enforcing these rules because the players are going to do everything they can to win and it's up to the organisers to actually reel them back in, then you start to have conflict that's purely out of game conflict about, are the referees doing a good enough job? Are these players cheating? All that sort of stuff. Whereas if instead of it being the organisers versus the players, more rules, try to restrict them, try to stop them. For example, in Hayden's thing, if it's someone actually breaking the integrity of their character to win, how are you ever going to write a rule that can actually enforce that? How are you going to be able to have one of your storytellers or one of your GMs actually come up to one player and say, I don't believe it makes sense for your character to do that, so you can't do it. It's too ambiguous. It's not an enforceable rule. So instead you need to have it be, actually, the way for you to be the most effective and be the most powerful is thematic, or is playing to the character, as with the War Machine example. And it's the same sorts of things that you see when they try to make those rule changes in sport is, okay, if we actually want less congestion in the game, or we want people to be kicking more than throwing, then we make kicking more valuable. So even though it's a more difficult skill, it's worth more. So now players actually have that risk reward of, do I try to do it because there's actually a chance that I can make this part of my most efficient meta game plan, instead of it just being, well, sure, it looks prettier on TV, so they want me to do it, but I'm going to win more games if I just run it and throw it. And I will stop talking about sport on our LARP panel now. But I think encouragement is definitely your best way to get through to competitive players. Make it worth them making those choices instead of trying to figure out some way to really nail them down.
I think one of the other best ways to really combat this, without taking that element out of the game, is to really focus on your balance and your mechanics. I hear a lot in game design, especially from people who don't really know much about the intricacies of it, where they talk about power creep and this thing's broken because it's overpowered. Well, I would say that if everything's broken, nothing is broken, unless your world is also broken. Right? You need some sort of restriction. So my example would be, if we're in a LARP situation and you give one of your characters the ability to channel a god. They're now way more powerful than everyone else in that game. But then you give everyone the ability to channel a god, and you balance those mechanics. Suddenly, the power is so much higher, but it's still balanced. You have a high-powered game, but everything there is broken, so nothing is. But then we bring in the world being broken. So if you have all of those players, and you open up the world, and it's not just, a field anymore, it's this giant universe and a sub-universe upside-down world, and some of those players can teleport, and some of them can go invisible. Suddenly, they're spending most of their time chasing one another and not actually achieving anything. And they have all this power, and they can't do anything with it, because your world's broken. But you grab all those high-powered characters, and you put them in a field, and you say, you can't leave the field. But know that those characters over there may not trust you. Those ones might. Use your powers wisely. Suddenly you have a high-powered game that is still interesting. So I think the takeaway from that example is that your balance is key. And you see a lot of people talk about this needs a nerf, that needs a buff. Realistically, if you balance your mechanics as it is, people are going to pick the meta based off their favorite now, instead of what is objectively the most powerful if everything's even. So then, if your world isn't broken, you can balance those mechanics purely through story. Hey, rogues aren't getting played. Everyone who shows up as a rogue in the next game gets an extra 5 gold pieces. Hey, there's a lot of in-game outcomes for rogues this next week. Things like that. I really go.
Oh, sorry, go. No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I really think that balancing those mechanics on paper is super, super important, and competition is going to exist, but you can counteract that by the way you write your rule set.
Cool. So Josiah's just mentioned that there is a great generalized discussion of rules of games within communities, including sport, by Bernie DeKoven in the Well-Play game, and it's a super fun read. I agree. I really love the Well-Played game. I've got some notes on it here that I'm going to read because I think that it will be a fun addition to this discussion. So the word well embraces the qualities of what we consider to be a state of excellence and health. Knowing that something is done well is an appreciation of the excellence of the deed as well as the excellence of the doer. The fact that we use the word well also to indicate a state of excellent health, that we can feel well, only enhances the wholeness that this word describes. When we play well, we are at our best. We are fully engaged, totally present, and yet at the same time, we are only playing. The well-played game is a game that becomes excellent because of the way it is being played.
I remember you posting that quote. I didn't like it, but I think that's got more to do with me. Just because of the language of the word "well" doesn't mean that to me, and does it mean that to everyone else? Because if it does, I'm very upset. Because I didn't think the word "well" meant
the context.
I think it does. I'm sorry, Hayden.
Yeah, sort of.
Also, he wrote an entire book on it. Maybe take it up with him.
Yeah,
with Bernie, our dude Bernie.
It's just like well means like just fine. Like it's not great. Like it's just well. I don't know. Yeah, sort of going off that, I agree. I think like one of the problems I've seen with some games is that the problem of like the game isn't being played well, and as a result, it suffers as a result. And it may not be a fault of the game; it might be a fault of the expectation setting and the way the players are approaching it. Because I know there have been some instances where, someone's been like, I just use a hypothetical example. It's like I want to build a really hyper competitive game for hyper competitive players. that's the first aim. But then I'm like, I don't know, what setting do I want for it? I'm like, fuck it, I'll put it in a cyberpunk setting. So I create this hyper-competitive game for hyper-competitive players. It happens to be in a cyberpunk setting. And I'll communicate that. I'll say this is a really competitive game for really competitive players. But then, because it's in a cyberpunk setting and it'll be the only one in Victoria in that setting, I'll also get a bunch of players who are coming to the game because they want to be a part of the setting. And then they will come and play, and they might be people who are interested in roleplay, in narrative, in immersion, who aren't getting any of that because they've come to the game for the setting, and then the mechanics of the game are, tailored toward the hyper-competitive player base, and these players have a terrible time, and then they're like, I had a garbage time, I didn't enjoy this LARP, and...
Just to then interject with Josiah, what Josiah is saying, and I would highly agree. I think playing excellently would be too perfectionist, whereas well has less expectation on the players. I think that for an expectation of an entire player base to play perfectly or excellently, more of well kind of, again, embraces the qualities of what we consider to be a state of excellence and health. Like, as in that the game felt like it was well played, that it was fair, that everyone was present, and that everyone was embracing the social contract of the game. And so I think that when we say well, we don't mean that like it was exactly okay.
No,
it wasn't really.
That's the assumption I've been going off. So I was like, okay, cool, I factored that in, and then so that's what I'm talking about. It's sort of like because it does feel good. Like there are games where it's like, cool, everyone playing knows what we're playing, they want to be here, and the game gets played well. And that's really good. Like that was a thing with the Hobbit's Hoedown. It was like it was a good game, it was good structure. But like we didn't know if it would survive contact with the player base. But then the player base came, and like by and large, they interacted with the game well. Like it was played well, and that made the game fun. Because if you'd had a player base who'd come and hadn't played it well, even though the game design, in a vacuum without players, which is an insane thing to say, was like good game design. If it was played poorly, it would have been so bad.
That's true, but I want to follow up on your cyberpunk competitive game example with a counter example. So if you think of Zeppelin had this issue, and so did After the Fall, where because we were using Nerf guns for weapons, we got a significant number of people who would contact us wanting to play the Nerf sport in steampunk costumes. Right? And they would talk about what were the allowed modifications for the guns and which models were okay and what muzzle velocity was appropriate and how modding bullets would work. And we said, this is not that kind of game. And After the Fall did the same thing. They did a really good job of communicating. They had a lot more of them because when you're talking about your, partly because the player base, the LARP player base is bigger when they're running, and also partly because it's a post-apocalyptic world is more appealing to that kind of player.
And their dog had played Fallout, which also influenced how players were expecting to play After the Fall.
Exactly true. And the organizers put in a fuck ton of work setting expectations correctly. And I think your cyberpunk game would need to put in a fuck ton of work setting expectations to hyper-competitive and dissuading those people who wanted to come and play the game that you don't want them to play.
Sure, but I think there will always be people who will try something because they want to be a part of the setting. Even if you're like, this is not a game for you, they'll be like, but the setting. I just think that's going to happen, and it's something I don't know. I think it's something that you do need to be prepared for.
It is interesting, though, when you're looking specifically at from a mechanics perspective, that those sorts of issues where it's about player type and player expectation and the communication divide, a lot of the time mechanics is the place that you can affect that the least. So as much as you can encourage the way that you want people to play with the mechanics and that sort of stuff, you can have two games that have the exact same rules, the exact same system, the exact same mechanics, and if the player base is different and engages with it differently, it's going to be a completely different result. One could be a perfect success, one could be a terrible failure. And unless it's something where, as an ongoing thing, you go, all right, well, we're going to stick with these players, we're going to try to adjust the system to better support them and better help them, or change things in the direction that they want to go, or rebalance, or whatever it is you've found out. It's probably more about some of those other things that we've talked about in Mixing Desk and Baby's First LARP, is where that problem might have come from, as opposed to it being that the mechanics have failed you.
Yeah, for sure. I agree. And sort of on that, do we want to move to material outcomes of mechanics? Because it seems like...
Just quickly.
Yeah.
Hey, Evil Fuzzy Doom has asked us, hey panel, how can mechanics and rules reinforce expectations around game experience? Does that kind of tie into our next subject?
That's actually... I was about to talk on something about that in regards to material outcomes. So,
fantastic. So, what is the intended outcome of mechanics, or how do game mechanics affect the roleplay of... No, that's the same one.
Yeah.
It was the next one, right?
Yeah, so...
Yeah.
So the segue,
please.
Yeah, so Evil Fuzzy Doom, sort of on that, I think... So one of the things we're looking at, so like Destiny and myself and Rick are working on like a Western LARP, and we were like trying to figure out, because obviously it's sci-fi Western, you got to have guns, got to have cool space guns, and we were like, cool, combat is going to be part of the game, how's it going to work? And this is where you come into the thing, because it's like, for LARP, the big two options, and there are more than the two, but the big two are Nerf guns or rubber band guns. And when we were thinking about it, because it's like, if you use Nerf guns have a higher rate of fire, more ammunition, generally less accurate, and generally less impact, because unless you're modifying your bullets in the gun, it's hard to sort of feel that you're being hit by
safe for children to play with.
Yeah, and it makes the combat, it changes the way combat feels. And one of the main things with Western gunfights is there's a lot of tension, there's a lot of, like, it's a very high risk, and basically once the fight starts, like, unless there's a lot of tables to hide behind, it's over very quickly. Like, that's the sort of, you've got your shootout, it's like someone fires a shot and it's over really fast. So we looked at, like, even though it's supposed to be set in this space future with space guns in space Western, we've sort of looked at, like, well, band guns, because, like, and this is sort of going off the way that gunfights in Black Powder and Bloodlines feel, because Black Powder and Bloodlines is, sort of flintlock, wheel lock era, guns are single shot, like, band guns are really good for that, but because everyone has basically, once you get hit by a bullet, your character can no longer fight, so you'll either be wounded or mortally wounded, depending on where you were hit. Gunfights are really short and very deadly, and players are really reluctant to fire the first shot, because if you fire the first shot and you miss, reloading takes like 10 seconds or longer, and in that time it's easy for you to fire a shot and then for the other person to run up to you and just shoot you and make sure they don't miss. And so it makes the fights very tense, and it makes the fights, like, kind of stressful, and they're also over very quickly because everyone is really fragile and guns are very deadly. And so that's the kind of feeling that is more suited to a Western. So sort of the thought was like, well, what if we use, like, band guns in this instance, because it makes the fights feel more like those sort of tense Western fights where, like, everyone's sort of waiting to see who fires the first shot. People are sort of edging to get into a position of advantage. Like, people are seeing, like, who's where, like, what's the nearest exit? Where's my nearest piece of cover? Like, if I miss, can I duck behind something to reload? Like, that fits that setting so much better, and that fits that roleplay. So even though it might be jarring to be like, oh, this is my space gun that fires once, and then I have to reload it immediately afterward, and reloading is sort of a laborious process, the actual fight itself feels way more setting appropriate. And then, look, there's still stuff we have to hammer out. Like, the game is nowhere close to being complete, but it's like, that's an example of where you can use mechanics and rules to reinforce not just the sort of expectations of the game experience, but also reinforce that sort of sense of roleplay and sense of genre atmosphere. Because, like, yeah, our players will come to the game wanting that Western experience, wanting that, like, you know, they want that tension, they want that tragedy, they want that sort of, like, that feeling of, like, you know, big impactful moments. And, like, Nerf guns don't do that. I've seen, like, especially, like, in, like, you know, fights where, like, no one can have their guns modded. You watch people fire, like, a dozen shots at each other and they go wide, and, like, you might not hit anyone, or you might fire 6 shots in a row that, like, just literally spin off into the distance. And so even though, like, it might be more practical or more people have, like, access to Nerf guns and stuff like that, you know, is this way you're thinking of doing something, is that reinforcing the game that you want to be played? And this extends to, like, more than just combat mechanics. It's just, like, I feel like this example is a very good example of how you can do that.
Well,
Yeah, and
you're right.
go ahead, Rick, please.
If you're looking at specifically the question of how do you encourage certain outcomes, or how do you support specific role play or modes of play, looking at where combat actually fits into your game is a really important factor of it. Like, there's a whole lot of LARPs that basically go, these are our combat rules, this is the rest of the game, and they don't spend time on what's the actual transition between the two, or the crossover. Can combat happen during the other parts of the game? Like, what's that look like? And you'll see a lot of LARP rulebooks where 90% of the rulebook is combat mechanics, and then there's only like 2 pages of other rules, or it's like character creation, combat appendices.
And then those games advertise themselves as much more about the role playing than the combat, and you say, "Is it?" Sorry, go on.
And then, as Hayden was talking about, when you're trying to decide even the simple factor of, like, what type of weapons can people use, as well as what do you want the gunfight to feel like in terms of how cinematic is it, how many shots should be fired, what are the consequences, and what's the risk and reward in that sort of thing. If you're looking at the player behavior of that transition into combat, if we want this game to be quite story and character driven and about the setting and about people, what can we do with the mechanics to discourage someone from going, I just want to shoot everybody and I'm just going to go rampage down Main Street all the time? And if your combat mechanics are slower and cinematic and high risk, to the point where if you're the guy that starts shooting people on Main Street, you're going to maybe kill 2 or 3 people before the rest of the players gun you down, then you've already got mechanics that discourage the type of play you don't want to see and encourage the kind of play that you do. You've got the threat of combat being much more appealing than combat itself, and although the combat still has the room to be competitive and satisfying if and when it does happen, someone going, oh, I don't care about the characters or the setting or anything, I'm just here to shoot people, is going to spend more time dead than somebody that is more interested in the parts of the game that you want to focus player direction on.
Something that comes opposite to combat as well, that we've been exploring, is because of the genres of Westerns. So, like, death and tragedy, or loneliness and vastness, like, those things are they're present in a lot of Westerns. So we were like, you know, we want to be able to explore grief and death, and conversely to combat. So, you know, how do we make more pageantry around death? And how do we encourage our players to mourn each other? And I guess that kind of brings us on to something that I remember Rob saying to me, which was that a lot of your mechanics need to kind of be predictable enough to look a little bit like each other. They need to mirror each other in ways that they support each other. And to make it a little bit more easier for your players to understand the flow of your rules and therefore to have an uninterrupted flow of gameplay. Does that make sense? Or am I just talking out of my ass?
No,
Okay,
I think
cool.
it does.
No, that makes sense.
Cool. Alrighty, cool. Sorry, Hayden, you were going to say.
I was just gonna, sort of on Rick's point is like, part of what he's saying there is it means you don't have to impose arbitrary restrictions, and it's like, because, as he said, if you start shooting in the saloon, you'll get 2 or 3 shots off before someone guns you down, if that. And it means we don't have to say, we don't have to impose the arbitrary restriction if it's like you can't shoot people or like in the saloon or like people are invulnerable, like. And because some games do that, some games have zones where it's like combat is impossible because of the way it's been designed, and like that's not a good or bad thing, but generally I think it's better to, if you're going to include a restriction, if it's an arbitrary one like that it's sort of like, the player's like, okay, but why can't I just murder people in the tavern? Like, what's stopping me from hitting them with a sword and them dying? It's like, and because it's like, and this is for more than just like combat mechanics, it's like, if your mechanics are set up in such a way that you can't just say players can do this at any time within the play space, and so you need to impose an arbitrary restriction. It's like, oh, but except in this situation, and then that situation doesn't make sense in the world you've created. It's probably not a great sign for your mechanics. And like, different games get around that in different ways.
Quickly on that, I think we've sort of brought up 2 specific sort of requirements of a good rule or of a good mechanic, which is that it has a purpose and you can actually justify it in game. Because you need to not just have, it's either arbitrary on one of 2 counts if it's a bad rule. It's arbitrary because why is this rule here? It's not adding or taking anything away from the game. It's not sculpting the way you want the game to play. Or it's an arbitrary rule, as Hayden said, where it's the game is still happening in this space, but there are parts of the normal game rules and mechanics that you can't use here. And if it's a good version of that, it's because there's an in-setting, in-character reason for it. Like, if it is a fantasy setting and there is specifically a spell of pacifism in this particular area or whatever, where people actually physically cannot force themselves to take aggressive actions towards other people, not only is that then a mechanic and a rule where you go, okay, we can't fight here and our characters know why, it also then is rule as drama, as conflict. You can have a character that is in that situation and can roleplay knowing, both as a player and a character, I really want to kill this guy right now. And I physically can't. And if I understand how that mechanic represents in game, I can properly roleplay. Is my body actually physically restrained? Is this even more upsetting than, like, you can have great scenes come out of it instead of it being, no, this is a safety rule, guys. You just can't fight in there. Our insurance doesn't cover it. Like,
yeah, and also if you've got that rule and it's well communicated, it's best when not just you know that that's how you're role playing, that everyone else knows that's how you're role playing too. That your rage is being tamped down by a spell of pacifism is a different role play to your hand is physically restrained if you touch your weapon, right? Like, those are different things. And your role play is made better if your audience knows what's going on.
I think if we go back sorry.
Oh, go ahead. Please, no. Go ahead.
As I say, if we go back to the very beginning, this is kind of why I defined mechanics as your flavor, and why I think it's such a good way to define it. It's because, you need those rules. Sometimes it is a safety issue, but if it doesn't have an in-world reason and consequence, then it's arbitrary and you're bored out of your character when you remember, I can't fight in the tavern because it's a safety issue, rather than, no, I can't fight in the tavern because I'm physically, I convulse if I try to because of this magic. it has to have some sort of flavor and some sort of beneficial reason for it to be there to make sense, essentially.
Just quickly, because I thought of an example that sort of contradicts what I was saying. So a great place to call out that there's always exceptions is, and it is always like safety is the number one, or like safety and code of conduct stuff is where you really want to be able to distinguish between these are out of character rules. This is why we have them. No discussion. Like they're hard and fast. You need to be able to protect your player base and yourselves. And you don't necessarily have to spend a whole bunch of time on trying to come up with in-setting justifications for code of conduct and safety and all that sort of stuff. But it is also a good example on why the more you can have those justifications, the better it is. I'm sure it's a fairly relatable experience, not just myself, but for you guys as well. You're in a combat scenario in a game, and the person that you are fighting is backing up towards unsafe terrain or the boundary edge of the field or something like that. That's the perfect situation for you to, as a player, not want them to get hurt and just stop and go, oh, hang on a sec, let's reposition, move away, or at least just call out that there's something behind them. Even if you are playing a character that, no, it's in my best interest for this guy to fall over, break his neck, and me not to have to fight him anymore. Those sorts of things are always going to come up in games. You shouldn't necessarily go, everything has to have, everyone's in character all the time. But it's when you are writing your rules and your mechanics, how much of that can you minimize so that your players are free to not have to break out into out of character mode as often as possible. And I think complexity is part of that as well. Like if there's a whole lot of, I think neural load was one of the phrases that we were using earlier. The more you have to actually physically pause, switch from character to Rick and go, wait, how much damage have I taken? Like, how long is this stun effect? Like, anytime that you're like doing counters or trying to figure out, like, remembering back to the paragraph of the rules that's relevant to what's happening is going to be a less immersive and less roleplay focused part of the game because you're having to switch between those two. So when you're writing your rules, the more you can think about percentage in character versus out of character, like breaks, the more opportunity you give your players to really have the best experience.
I think this is what I said earlier on. Sorry, Des.
I have a follow-up to that later.
Yeah, I think that it's really great to, when you're writing rules, to again go back to that mixing desk and just look at the big picture and then just say, how am I delivering my intention through my rules? Whether it's safety, whether it's the feeling that you're giving your players, or for even if like you're trying to, as an organizer, elicit a particular response from your player base. It's always really, really important to think about those things. Matt, you were saying, sorry.
Yeah, so one of the things I said earlier was that I feel like the best rules feel invisible while your mechanics feel very visible. And I think this is like a great point to reiterate that. If I'll use Magic the Gathering as an example again, because it's like well known and it's a good example. The rule book for Magic the Gathering is roughly 200 pages long in a PDF at 12-point font. But I could teach someone to play that game in about 5 minutes. So complexities of rules versus understanding of the basics and what is necessary to play the game is also really important to think about when you're designing. So for Magic, all you really need to know, there are 7 card types and there is a turn structure, and then everything else is on the card. And like that's where your mechanics come into play. If you're using spell tags, your spell tags are colored. If you're using a band gun, your guns have to be physical representations of what you're using. Those are all small mechanics that flavor your rules to make your rules easier to hide, essentially.
Yeah, as Avi the Jackal says, generally complexity in character generation or advancement is preferable to complexity that has to be applied in combat. I would agree, yeah. The less sort of meta game that your players have to do in order to just, to continue play, and something that is going to like disrupt your flow of your gameplay is probably going to be something in which, yeah, you do have to like stop and apply the complexity to the combat that you are currently in.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I think a good example there is figuring out your hit points off field before the fight. Like if you have to do trigonometry for that, that's fine. But once you're in the fight, you know your hit points, and that's good. Also, we have a question from Josiah as well. But Joe, did you want to say something before that?
I did, because I think that the choice about how complicated something has to be is actually a slider that you can use. It doesn't have to be, it's not automatically better. I used to play a game called Philosopher's Guild back in the 90s. And in that game, there was an incredibly complicated combat system where, if I got, because of my armor and my toughness and the bless spell, if I got hit on a limb, that limb would lose 2 points. If I got hit by a double on the limb, it would lose like 7. If I got hit by a triple, it would lose 12. And there was a very fine-grained sort of system. And doing it, if I was rewriting it, I would make it significantly less fine-grained. But one thing that it enabled was these glorious hero moments that you could have because of the complexity and because of the system. You could get to characters that could do ridiculous things. And so people who were who'd built their characters according to the rules and done the stuff, you could go, oh, actually, no, I can take 36 goblin stabs, 2 lightning bolts. Like, I can take, a dragon to the face, but if you zap me with an electric spell, then I'm going to fall over. Or if you turn off my cleric healing, I'm going to fall over. Twice a day, I can do ridiculous damage. And so it was okay to sacrifice immersion for complexity because it gave us those moments. And I think that you just have to be aware that you're sacrificing the immersion, but you can. Oh yeah, flaming triple. Oh my god, so good.
Oh my god.
And, one of the other things that Joe mentioned when we were just chatting briefly before we got the stream running was one of the things that I think is really important is if you sit the complexity on the player that is in charge of those abilities as opposed to the target that it's affecting, that's also a really good way of allowing you to have more complexity without it slowing stuff down. It's a lot easier for players to have the time to research and prepare and really fully understand everything that applies to their character or their character sheet or however your system works without it being your character for this game to run smoothly needs to understand the abilities and potential of every single other player here.
Yeah, that was one of the flaws that we had in Watchers of Easthaven, I think, where we had like 20 different things that you could call to hit somebody.
Yeah.
And people had to understand what happened when each of those things was called at them. And I think that was a mistake.
Yeah, people just being like, wait, is this cleaving or rending? What no, that cleaving does that one. It's rending. This is rending.
Yeah, no, I've definitely been in too many LARP games in my first year of LARP where the entire flow of a game broke down, and then there would have to be a GM or like some kind of rules referee that would come over to clarify the rules of the engagement. And those are, as a player, the most frustrating parts of rules, and they're the symptoms, I guess, then of those mechanics. Being in a dispute during combat is one of the most unfun things to do, and I would rather shelf an entire ottoman.
Yeah. Sort of, this does actually touch on. So I just want to go back to Josiah's question. He asked before, out of curiosity, when have you all had experiences where your design rules mechanics have not reinforced the intended game experience? When have mechanics not worked? Perhaps this can be addressed later. Well, I just want to say, and sort of it does touch on this, is this was actually I was running some small quests for some warband members where I'd introduced extra mechanics. I'd gotten some people in, and before the quest, I'd given the person for whom the quest was being run, the character was a dryad. I'd given them some spells and stuff that allowed them to travel between trees, and then I realized that at the end of the quest, the boss she was going to fight, she was just going to be wipe the floor with them without actually having to fight them. And the whole point was to test her fighting ability. And I was like, oh, no, this doesn't work. So sort of on the fly, I had to be this person's immune to magic for reasons. And I was like, it didn't feel good because it felt like I'd given this player something and then taken it away from them, pulled the rug out from under them for no real, it was because I'd made a mistake before, in design. And then sort of it was confusing for both these people because both the boss enemy and this player was sort of confused at the end because they were like, so wait, what does or doesn't affect things? And Disney just mentioned being in a dispute sucks, but also being confused in a situation that's supposed to be tense or frightening is bad. When it's supposed to be this massive epic battle and then everyone stops and is like, so when a siege engine, if you tilt it, is that legal, or how many dudes did you have? No, sorry, can we get and it's that's bad. And again, going back to the sort of introducing an arbitrary restriction on a player's ability to do something is not something I would have wanted to do. And there are better ways I could have done that, and with more forethought, I would have. But that's just off the top of my head. That's probably the most striking example to myself of a time when I've added something and I've been like, oh no, this doesn't work.
Yeah, both Des and Hayden's sort of examples of the what really kills those moments and the conflict of it both remind me of a lot of time gets spent when you're looking at LARP rules trying to make a live action version of something else. So a lot of the time people are trying to adapt video games or adapt tabletop games or whatever it may be. And nothing is a clearer example of the uniqueness of the LARP format versus all those other things than calculation time. If you have a LARP system that does not run well, you will suddenly find that although it is live action, your combat is taking the same amount of time as it does at a tabletop role-playing game. And for those of you that play D&D or other tabletop games, sometimes that's 3 hours for 4 people to fight 2 dudes, and you're still not done yet, and the DM's pulling in minion rules to speed stuff up, and everyone's pre-rolling, and it's dramatic at the time because you're all just focused on the outcome. But the strengths of LARP are in it being real time and live action and you physically doing it. You don't, well, I won't say you don't because some people still love that, but the concept of a LARP game where everything's in real time and then almost Final Fantasy style, it switches to now we're in combat, everyone just sort of stands still in the general area of combat and starts quoting rules and citing abilities and calculating damage. Having referees and judges and storytellers to help facilitate that stuff isn't a bad thing. In fact, the more staff you have helping run stuff in your game, probably the better. But if your rules are complicated enough that you spend more time explaining them at the event in real time than you do actually seeing them happen, that's not great in my opinion. And if your rules are ambiguous enough that you run into those rules as written versus rules as intended versus each player's own attempt at twisting the definition, that's when you end up with, instead of it being the ref is there to help with complicated stuff, it's this player wants it to mean this player wants it to mean this. The ref is in a weird mediator role of trying to decide, and as with even the biggest sporting events in the world, the refs end up being hated by whoever comes out on the losing side of that discussion.
Also, I just got to go. Deck's up. I'll be back in like 2 minutes.
So did anyone else have examples of mechanics that hadn't worked? Did we want to talk on that for a minute?
Oh, yeah, I guess so. So something that happened to myself was actually at After the Fall. When I was playing Danny May, my first ever character, and After the Fall is a very rules heavy kind of game. You've got a stat sheet. You have different stats, and they affect what you can do, like different calls that you can make. They also affect your health points. And one day, I think it was almost the first day, because I wasn't really truly across all of the rules. Like I had managed to, because I had to get together with a group of people to sort of really nut out what the stat sheet would look like to get it kind of correct. We had to sort of have like a sort of like study group session to be able to figure it out. And then once we figured it out, and the types of like things or like abilities that I had, and then when it came to combat, when I was actually amidst the combat, I completely blanked on the things that I could do within combat. And After the Fall is not one of those games in which you want to forget what you can do during combat because death is permanent. And I forgot that I could dodge hits up to 5 times a day. And I instead took the L because I completely forgot. And my character ended up dying. And then I looked, like when I was like going over like my stat sheet for my next character, like re-rolling, and then sort of looking back at my old character, I was like, oh yeah, those abilities that I totally had that I could have used during that, I could have lived, and now I'm dead permanently. Like, oh no! Like,
what?
Yeah. So, it really didn't, like, the intended mechanic of death being real was definitely there, but like I couldn't really interact properly with the combat mechanics because there was so much that it became a bit difficult to really be across it all and to really hold all that information at the same time as being like swarmed by a bunch of inbred hillbillies from the mountainside.
Yeah,
We've
right.
all been there.
We've all been there. I still remember, just quickly, a game where I was a demon thing and I threw a ball at Lisa McCorrist and went, Hexa, knockback, fire, something else. And she sort of looked at me and I watched her head go from it, and then she just like threw up her hands and sat down. Just because she's like, I'm just not doing the math. And just sat down.
That sounds like something that I probably lose against. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a lot. It's more than I'm willing to do, so I guess I'm out. Jack, I'm not talking about quick draw now because that was a mechanic that worked perfectly in every way. So it was exactly excellent. I'm leaving it there. The science and invention rules in Zeppelin. Vanny, I need to know who you are. I have clearly played a lot of games with you. I don't know who you are. It's driving me crazy. Okay. The science and invention rules in Zeppelin games were a huge headache for us because we had created a system that was like a tenth of the complication of the other systems that were around at the time, except for science and invention, which were so complex. And we did this thing where all the complication was on the back end, and you would sit down and you would do the idea was that you would do a whole bunch of work in the back end, designing your invention and giving it stats and giving it numbers and working out all the things. And this would simulate your character doing the same thing, right? Yes, it was complicated. Yes, it was difficult. And yes, you had to do a bunch of maths, but you're a scientist and an inventor, so that's how it goes. And that's what you do. And so we had a big complicated system for doing it. But what happened was that when people actually engaged with it, it was the end numbers that they got were things that would take them 5 events to make. And we were like, that's super cool. You can spend like 5 events designing an awesome thing and it'll be great. And so no one invented anything. Or they only invented short things, because when you're running 1 or 2 events a year, who wants to spend 3 years on a cool gadget in game when they could spend significantly less time? And it turned out that what you could do is, rather than that, make 3 devices that stopped you dying every event. I die, I immediately get injected with a thing that like heals me for 1 point or stabilizes me. And you're like, well, no one built anything interesting, because our system that we designed to make it super cool to build cool things actually made it impossible to build cool things.
Yep.
Well, I was going to bring up an example of there weren't my mechanics. It was a game that I was playing, opposite problem to Des, actually, where I was playing a warrior where their base mechanic was that they have lots and lots of hit points, and that was essentially it. But I think the issue with that design was that there was no restriction on it. So I had an item that allowed me to self-heal. And I also had the ability to use a polearm while I was wearing full plate armor. I've had about 10 years of training in polearm, so I'm decent at it. But I could also outfight most of the people on the field when I had a polearm and double the hit points of everyone else, and I could self-heal. And I had a fight that lasted for about an hour, where I single-handedly took down an entire army and healed close to 80 hit points. When, the base hit points for most people in the game was about 5. And that, I think, was an issue with no restriction. There just wasn't enough restriction there. In terms of my mechanics failing, it wasn't a LARP game. It was actually a card game that I made, but it was also a lack of restriction, where I had a card that would allow you to essentially draw a whole bunch of cards. But I hadn't quite done the math properly on the number of cards in a deck and how many cards this card would let you draw. And so one of my playtesters cycled through his deck 4 times in a turn just to get the card that he was looking for. Because he could. And it was one of those things where, like, I didn't have a mana system or anything like that. If the card said you could do it, you could do it. And he just cycled through. It took him about 20 minutes to find the card he was after, but he did it because the rule said that he could do it if the card said so. So it was, again, that was a lack of restriction on my behalf, on my mechanics, that sort of led to things just being silly and not fun.
Oh, I have another one. Where recently one of our friends has been running a game where you play gods, and you are gods in the Agora, and it's like a politics and hidden information and secrets discussion game. And we're like, a friend of mine, and it's a playtest, and a friend of mine and I went, oh, you know what we should do? We should play one god. just two different players and two different people playing the same character. And so we're literally the same character, but we're two people. And so the way the rules worked was that we got twice as much resources and twice as much information and twice as much stuff as everyone else, but we were the same character, so we were doing the same thing, and we could justify sharing all of our stuff perfectly. And it turns out that perhaps it's worth writing into your rules that one person can only play one character, or only one person can play one character. I don't know, but we broke it. It was great.
Yeah, I think another sort of example of this is something that, like, because sometimes you'll have something in your rules that comes out and it has the sort of opposite impact where it's like it wasn't an outcome you intended, but it's a good outcome. And I think an example like that is the some of the siege mechanics that they had at Swordcraft for a while, which I think are being reintroduced, but they were there for a while, and I think basically for like logistical and safety reasons, stuff got switched in and out and phased in and out. But like, basically it was like because of safety, people can't scale these scaffold fortresses you have. So all the fighting happens in this gatehouse that's like 2.5 meters high, 2.5 meters wide. So you can have like maybe at most 6 people or maybe 7 people fighting in this gatehouse at a time, because that's the most people you can fit. And obviously, like, head hits aren't illegal, hand and foot hits aren't legal. So like, it's hard to sort of break these through. But these really slow, grindy fights were actually incredibly fun for a whole group of players. I was one of them. I loved those fights. But they were exhausting, and they could go for like an hour and a half. I know one event, there was a siege where my side was defending with 15 players versus another side attacking us with, I think, 120, and the defending side, there was no resolution. They literally had to stop. Just because they couldn't grind through the healers on our side, and sort of, and this was a problem because it was like it meant that fights could be stalled indefinitely, but like it was so incredibly fun, and like even though it was exhausting, like being in one of those fights was so incredibly fun. But it appeals to a specific kind of person who's totally okay getting stabbed in the head with a pike repeatedly, and I'm definitely like one of those people. I love it. But it's like, it was not an intended outcome of the game design, but it is an outcome that they got nonetheless. And sort of every time they've spoken about sieges, there's been this section of the play they sort of like, yes, because I want to go back to that time where I was like funneled into this really small space, and was basically like in there jostling people, because like academically I was like, oh, I'm not the kind of person who'd enjoy that. I don't weigh a lot. I'm easy to jostle. I'm not going to have a good time. And it was really fun. And I think this is also worth keeping, like, if you're designing a game, and as Rick said before, like no rule set or mechanic set is going to survive contact with your player base. But it's also, there will be outcomes from your rules that you didn't predict that will be good, and you'll want to keep those. Or they'll be good, and maybe they'll be like, oh, this doesn't work for my game or for my setting, but you can be like, oh, maybe I'll utilize that later in a different game.
Or it makes you think of an outcome that you hadn't looked at before, and you can write a better rule that delivers that intentionally.
Yeah, exactly. So like, yeah, it's worth keeping an eye out for these like random permutations you get, because it's like, yeah, obviously no one wants a 90-minute siege where there's no outcome, but they changed sieges, they added other stuff that allowed them to go much more quickly, or at least have a resolution after 90 minutes. And yeah, that's definitely worth, like, keep an eye out for stuff that comes up in the material outcomes of your game, where it's like you either want to keep it and maybe work on it, or keep it and use it for something else, or just keep it.
I'll just quickly chuck in one last example of a bad mechanic. Again, taking the easy way out and picking one where I was a player as opposed to one that I actually wrote myself. But complete opposite to Hayden's example, and I think gives us one of the most important things, which is when you're looking at that golden rule number 1 of fun, mechanics to avoid at all costs are things that impact player agency. Because the most surefire way to stop someone from having fun is for them not to actually be playing anymore. And no matter how much you can justify that their character is still playing, if they are not in control of that character, that's it. Like, it's ruined. So, simple mechanic, and it's one that has been implemented poorly in a lot of other games, not just in this one. Quickest way to sum it up is stun lock. So, at an event where they were introducing a town-style setup for their first time ever, to try and get people spending money, they set up a blacksmith that could randomly put different buffs on your weapons for the night. And as with Matt's example, not enough restriction. So one of the 1 in 4 chances that you could get was that your weapon could do a 4-second stun. No limit on how many times you could do that or how often. So suddenly, it didn't matter how good you were in combat or how high your hit points were or what your other abilities were. If a group of enough people managed to finally land a hit on you with stun, that's 4 seconds where you can't defend yourself. And then they can reapply the stun before it times over or right as it times over, and you get the really thrilling LARP mechanic of seeing players visibly standing there just staring daggers at these people because they have all of the hit points, but they're physically not allowed to fight back, and so they have what feels like a very long combat of just, are you dead yet? Are you dead yet? Are you dead yet? Stun again. Are you dead yet? Are you dead yet? Are you dead yet? Stun again. Are you dead? To the point where the majority of players at that event went and started a fighting pit circle where the rule in the fighting pit was none of the actual game mechanics applied. It was like no special abilities, everyone's on equal hit points, all weapons do the same damage, and like 90% of the players at the event went, oh, what's going on over here? And joined that instead because there's no risk of you losing player agency and not being able to actually play. And even if you lose, it feels fair, it feels balanced, you know what's going on, and that the stakes get pulled out of it where you've got this breeding resentment of feeling hard done by and feeling like it's unfair that you're losing. In the fight pit, it's once you lose, someone heals you up and then you just wait your turn, you jump back in, and it becomes that more fun version of it.
Sorry, as Evil Fuzzy Doom is saying in the chat, yeah, if players write their own LARP in your LARP and play that instead of your LARP, you might have fucked up. I'll be back in a second.
I don't think that's the same as having like a little like fan spin-off LARP, to be clear. But yeah, if people are like, we're gonna go do this now, then
I'm gonna make my own mechanics with blackjack and hookers.
Yeah, then you need to maybe perhaps put out a survey and really take into account what your players are saying and really just try and manage exactly what your unintended symptoms were of your mechanics and rules.
Yep.
What if you force them to play a LARP in your LARP?
I've been in that situation. One of the first quest battles I ever did was everyone's character was LARPing it was like a battle that didn't count. It was like a LARP within it was weird. It was really bizarre. I think it was just because they were like, things got resolved more quickly than the organizers had expected. So they were just like, we're doing this now. And everyone just had a fight anyway. But like, it was sort of like, yeah, all your characters are just laughing this one.
There's always time for a dream ballet, Hayden.
Yeah, just quickly, Idiot Nerd 27 has said, like warband side quests at Quest. I would say not really. I would actually go as far as to say that now we are getting into the difference of a LARP game design flaw and a LARP game design aspect.
Yeah, that's... it depends whether... Because sometimes those side quests are, between this event of the LARP and this event of the LARP, I'm going to fit in this side quest that I wrote because I want to do those things the game is offering, but during this down period, I still want to be doing this stuff. And if those players wrote those side quests because they don't want to engage with your LARP's mechanics. So a lot of the side quests I've wrote were in addition to stuff that was already going on. Some of them I wrote were to replace what was there because I thought it was garbage. So it depends in what context. If players are
Yeah.
doing it because they don't want to engage with what you created, you need to look at what you've created, because otherwise it's probably just the case that those players are there because the players are there for reasons other than what you're doing, which is probably not a great sign.
If they're doing their own thing as well, that's great. They're loving it. They want to create more content in between what you're able to provide. If they're doing their thing instead, that's bad.
Yeah, I think when we talk about bug or feature, a really good one to sort of, for me to quickly point at, was Black Powder and Bloodlines. They have a mechanic in which if you are nobility as a class, I believe you already get a plot of land, and then you have like an amount of wealth that you can accrue on that plot of land, because in between games, if you don't have a plot of land, or you don't know someone who does and can allow you to store your food, your black powder, or your wealth, you can't accrue it. And therefore, if you already own land and then you're accruing wealth on that land, it's easier for you to then own more land, and it's harder for you if you don't already have it. And there was a lot of people as players who were like, this is a bad game design because it is easier if you already own land for you to accrue wealth. And then the game designers were like, indeed, isn't that so fucked?
Heck, there.
What do you know? It's the point.
Colonialism in the game works like colonialism in the game.
Yeah. Or, for example, religious people being frustrated at the futility or the mysteriousness of the faith mechanic. Because, we've done all this praying, we've done all this, we've been really pious, and we keep doing all these things out of faith that it will make it better, but it's not, and that's very frustrating. And it became sort of a discussion point of like, well, actually, is that a game aspect? Is the frustration that you're feeling as a player also a frustration that you're feeling as a character? Wouldn't your character feel frustrated at their faith? Is this not a good sort of indication of just how well almost that mechanic kind of demonstrates itself? So there's definitely, you can use those things to really communicate or reveal just how unjust something can be, if that is the aim. And I mean, it's completely valid that people would either try and find a way around it, or they would be frustrated by it.
Well, this also comes to the question of, it's like, when your mechanics are intended to produce that kind of frustration, because again, it is like, it's easier to accrue wealth in the real world and during the colonial period if you were already a person of means than if you weren't. And the reason the mechanic is that way is because that's what the world is like, and the game is trying to say something about, the world and politics and colonialism. And then so you come to this thing where it's like, a part of the world that was bad to experience is part of the game, and that's bad to experience because that's what the world is like, and it sucks that the world is that way. Maybe you should think about that. On the same hand, this is a game that you're playing and it's bad to experience. And there is a lot of discussion to be had there, because you need your game. Your game doesn't need to be fun, but it needs to be worthwhile for the players. And if you have players who are coming and having a bad time, but not getting anything worthwhile out of it, so, maybe you come and you have a bad time, you're like, man, I had such a shitty time, but yeah, fuck, colonialism, it's fucking dogs coming in, fuck, that sucks. I'm so mad about this. It motivates me to do some things in my own life. Like, that's worthwhile. That's political change. But it's like, if you are coming to the game and having a bad time, but none of that comes away with you, and you're just sort of like, what a badly designed game, that sucks. That's like, that could be to do with player expectations. That could be to do with like maybe the way your mechanics are producing that outcome aren't obvious enough, or maybe it's not like there's something there that needs to sort of be looked at. And because yeah, not every single LARP has to be fun. Like not all LARPs are going to be fun, and that's fine. But it's like like players are going to want to come to your game and play it, and they don't want to come away having had a shit time and got nothing out of it.
The desirable experience doesn't have to be fun.
Yeah.
But there needs to be an experience that they wanted, which is why they came, and they need to have had that experience when they leave, or they are not going to give you their money and come again.
Fully engaged.
Yeah. And as Joe mentioned earlier, so like when I said that like in Blackadder and Bloodlines, running out of food and starving to death is a fail state, and he was like, not necessarily, like that could be, it's like dying is a completely, like that's a prompt you can like springboard off that. There's like a lot of mileage in that, and I would agree, to be honest. Sort of, I think in like a very sort of purely mechanical, it's like my character wants to be alive, and if they die, they didn't get what they wanted. Not fantastic. But as a player, it's like, cool, I got to do this tragic thing. Sucked, my character died. Maybe there was a noble sacrifice, or maybe it's just like, the world. But it's like, you could have that experience. You could die and still be like, man, that was so good. I died, but it like, I had this whole arc. Like, I was this big villain. Like, a lot of people hated me. I was treated like garbage, but it felt good to be bad. And you wouldn't have had fun, but it's like it's a worthwhile outcome. And like, yeah, like in games, there are going to be times when you want to introduce a mechanic that has an outcome that isn't necessarily a fun one, but it's important to the theme or purpose of your game, and you need to play test that a lot, because if it's just making players have a bad time and the intended effect isn't coming through, you gotta look at that.
And on that note, one thing that has been a mistake every time I've seen it tried is doing that with the food. Don't fuck with people's food, or with people's real world food. A couple of LARPs I've played have done it, where what they've done is part of the game, they've made the food either bad or look bad or hard to get to. Or been like, no, you're not going to starve. You can go out of character and eat, but you can't. The in-character food where your character is, that's going to be shitty, and that has made for more upset players and more angry human beings than anything I've ever seen in LARP.
Yeah, I think that. When you start to mess with the actual well-being of your players, that's when it's like, whoop, don't do that.
Never write a LARP that centers around literally depriving your players of sleep. Don't do it. You'll be like, oh man, I'll write this horror experience. The players won't be able to sleep. They'll go to sleep. I'll wake them. We'll spook them. No, that's bad. That's bad. Don't do that.
Don't put your players into survivor mode, because that's like when people's like base instincts will start to kick in, and you don't want that, because they're no longer role playing, they are just pissed off.
I remember I played a game where I was NPCing. I was an orc, and we were running orc raids all night, and I snuck into Avi, who's in chat, Avi and Phil Petrushka's cabin, to like whack Avi in his sleep, and they were in a bunk. And so I like whacked Avi with my sword and did my big orc voice. And Phil, like, he's like 6'2" and 110 kilos, and he leapt out of the top bunk naked and landed on me and tackled me into the ground. Because of course he fucking did. And so I had this giant naked teenager slam into me, and then Avi hit me to death. So you need to be really careful with the sleep thing is, I think, the backup story here.
Des, that was supposed to be a story of what not to do? Just
Yeah, but also I had a giant naked teenager slam into me. Name me your sex tape.
God damn. Yeah, well, because it's also like, because there are sort of exceptions to that. Like, one of the big ones, one of the obvious ones is like, at Swordcraft, I've been a warband leader, I've been in the siege quests. You got to have your warband up ready at 8 a.m. They hate it. They hate you forever. But also, that's not the game organizers, it's the players waking each other up, so fuck them. That's not on you. But as an organizer, yeah, don't make your game interfere with Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
That was in terms of the arbitrary ones, the siege at a quest that had the most bad blood of any of the ones that I was involved in was one of the, I think it was the first lot of siege quests.
One at Treetops?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where it was the blue siege defending for a whole bunch of days and then eventually just out of character breakdown of here, just take the flag, like fuck off type resolution, which is not fun for anyone. But the driving cause behind that frustration was that the mechanics said to be a valid participant in the siege, you had to be within like 10 meters of the front gate when the siege starts. And everyone in our camp was actively cooking lunch at the time that this particular siege started, and the cooking equipment was outside of that area. So people suddenly had to, as a player, make the decision of, am I going to defend my camp in character, or am I going to either eat or take proper precautions to put this fire out? Or like it became we're being deprived of food or we can't be competitive discussion instead of a, hey, there's a siege happening in character. We want to rally and defend our base. This is what we're here for. Everybody to the battlements type thing.
So the initial plan for that had actually been to hit you during before breakfast. But we didn't get up early enough.
I think this was like the third separate siege that same day.
Because I was the leader for our faction that quest, and I wasn't able to leave, so I was sort of tangentially involved in planning. That was partially on purpose. It's like at another quest during a siege, I waited until I knew a large portion of a faction would be out trying to run their tournament before I sieged them, because it meant that in a similar way, it's like they changed that rule because this was the quest afterward. They changed that rule because obviously it created outcomes like that. It was really shitty. So instead I was like, cool, I know at 12 this faction will be running a tournament. It'll take like 25 players out of their thing. So I was like, we'll siege them at this time. And basically what happened was those players got locked out and they were still allowed to come and fight. But because you only needed a few people to hold a gateway, it meant that they couldn't force their way back in through the people sieging them. And then at that event, there was a rule that was like, if you die, you can't come back to the siege. So there was like this weird group of dead people who died like waiting there, but then that only applied to the siege attackers and the siege defenders. And so Blue Camp, which was not involved in the siege because they weren't attacking or defending, then came up several times and attacked us while we were sieging. And when they died, they were allowed to go and then come back and attack us. And it was really bizarre because it was like they weren't involved, so they were exempt from that ruling. And yeah, it was like another example of like those mechanics not quite working. But it's also, again, that goes back to like, I was a highly competitive player. And I was able to make these decisions that were in the best interest of winning, because it's like, obviously, if I want to win, I'm going to hit your camp when it's least convenient for you. Maybe you're holding a tournament, maybe you're cooking lunch. And it's that
sort of strategy element is what you want to encourage.
Yeah, and that's one of the problems, is it's like this thing where it's like, you don't want players to have a bad time, but you've also created an environment where players are rewarded in the context of the game's competition to hit each other at the least convenient time. And so what happens was, we see you having lunch, we siege you at that time because the game allows us to do so, and the way the game is set up, like, the easiest way to reach the success state is to do that. And so we did, and everyone felt bad And I felt bad because I was like, oh, I'll just hit him when it's least convenient. And then I saw how upset people were, and I saw how upset our side was because no one felt good about it, and because I'd sort of been half involved in the planning because I was like, again, that quest I was not having a good time. I wasn't allowed to leave the camp. Oh, it was just bad. But I was like, I saw everyone had a bad time. I was like, that does not feel good. I don't like the outcome of this. I'm unhappy.
Yeah, but that's the
Yeah.
mechanics encouraging play that is not the play that you really want at the game, right?
Well, I think it's still the decision to attack at that time is still what you want to encourage. Like that's how you get advantage in the sieges, that sort of thing. It's those weird arbitrary fringe mechanics and rules. Like the being away from camp and at a tournament is the sort of thing where you go, we've caught them out, they've made a mistake. But people actively staying in camp to defend it and then being told they're not allowed to defend it because they were
you didn't
two
start this
in their
weird
camp.
box in the game.
Yeah, but
and then again with like the respawn mechanics and stuff that you mentioned in the second one, like those are things where it's, if you ask the writers, they can probably tell you what their intended purpose for that rule was, but the in-character justification of it is just not there. So like, why can we come back to life in other battles but not this one? Why is there an imaginary border around where some mechanics apply and they don't apply outside of that? And those are the bits that are going to cause frustration around your players. And things like siege weapons, as a safety mechanic, you can't fire them if anyone's in the dead zone of a couple of meters in front of it. But that means that the encouraged, most efficient tactic to stop a siege weapon is to suicide charge at it so that you're standing in front of it too close.
We had a
and
lot
they're
of
not allowed. They're not allowed to fire as a player.
Machines get broken by heavily armored players charging the machine, because it meant if you have a heavily armored player charge our siege weapon, they can't stop themselves because of inertia. They collide with the siege weapon. The shot we fire at them doesn't count because it was fired when they were within 3.5 meters. So our siege weapon gets broken and they survive the shot. And so now we've got a broken siege weapon, and also this person who didn't use the rules as intended has like not been punished for it, and it feels bad. This is
that's where they need to be like player rules and more code of conduct and like safety and yellow cards and red cards and that sort of stuff needs to come into that, as opposed to it being these are the mechanics of the combat and you can do whatever it takes to win within those mechanics. Because those will be the common things that cause issues with your players, and end with people getting hurt because they're using safety rules to try to gain advantage in a mechanic. What did you want to move on to, Joe?
I thought we could move on to deep dives because it's 3:00. I need to leave by 4. I don't know how you guys are going for time.
Oh, that's okay. Just quickly, I did want to bring up Josiah's question. This raises a question for me about LARP and education, or LARP and lessons for players. This is a focus for designers. Is this a focus for designers, rather? I.e., that players leave having learned something. Can you control the lessons that they take away? And Jakal's also said, I think, Josiah, that can extend to creating a space in which players are able to experiment and create good associations of their own. I mean, that's generally how I tend to approach design like that. If I am trying to get across a message or a feeling or something like that, it is important to me that rather than, as Jack was saying, rather than being like, you need to feel this, you need to kind of lead them through that lesson. And by its own merits, it should be able to sort of like impart an emotion to your players. Because I think that you can be like, full up, you can lay the facts out and like the sort of numbers game of a thing. But if you are intending to teach a lesson, the important part of that you are trying to influence is the emotion of the player, because that is the thing that will leave a lasting lesson, is how the player feels about the experience that they have gone through.
I feel in this one, sort of especially, and even this is based on my own experience, and I feel like Matt will probably have greater insight into this than I will, but one of the big things is, for learning, you need to be able to make mistakes, but you also need to be able to then apply not blame, I guess, but apply responsibility for that mistake to yourself and be like, okay, I made this mistake. Why was the reason? And then learn from that. Because I think, and you see it especially in like very competitive environments, like as the sort of the most jokey example would be something like League of Legends, where it's like, this is everyone's fault but mine, where players make mistakes regularly, but they always externalize responsibility, so they never learn from those mistakes because it's always someone else's fault. And so if you've got an environment where players have the opportunity to make a lot of mistakes, if they're still in an environment where they are externalizing responsibility, which is usually a result of like highly competitive environments or an environment where mistakes are punished, so they need that mistake to have been someone else's fault, they won't learn. So as far as I'm concerned, I think, and it doesn't necessarily have to be learning through mistakes. Like trial and error is not the only way to learn, but it's like, if you want players to learn through trial and error, not only does it have to be an environment where they can make those mistakes, but it needs to be an environment where them accepting responsibility for their mistakes is not only acceptable, but encouraged. Because, the only reason I learned from what I did was because I was like, oh, I did these things and they were bad. And it's like, yeah, even before with like Rick saying like, it felt shitty when we were sieged at lunch. Like, I was like, cool, I was one of the people who helped make that choice. I did not feel good about it. That was a mistake on my end, and I was responsible for that choice. And if I'd externalized blame, I wouldn't have learned from that.
But that's the role of feedback in education a lot of the time, where it's discussing with the person who's made the mistake or discussing with the person who you're trying to teach and showing them where the error is, or designing mechanics that make it obvious, make it easy for them to discover where the error was and easy for them to learn from it, right? So your mechanics need to encourage the lesson you're trying to teach. And education is full of these things. And when you're not careful about the lessons you teach, then you will teach unintended lessons. It's like the one where I was like really impressed with, I'd set up this video lesson with a quiz on the end of it, and you couldn't finish the thing until you'd answered all the questions on the quiz. And over a couple of weeks of these, my kids got better and better until they were finishing them really quickly, and I was super impressed. I'm like, oh my god, how are you guys finishing these so quickly? Now you guys must have learned my lessons really well. But no, they'd figured out that you could just, that the quiz wouldn't progress until they clicked the right answer, so they would quickly click all the answers.
Yeah. And that's the, from my, when I was doing performing arts as my previous career, I did theatre education and shows in schools and that sort of stuff as well. And a big part of that is, even though you can get those emotional responses, you can get people to relate to the characters, you can have those lessons be conveyed in that much more interactive space. The question and answer portion at the end is where you're going to find out whether you actually got across the message to everyone as to what they were doing. If there's anything they were confused about, that's where you can clarify that. And then the teacher's still following up on it with worksheets or whatever else is where that really gets bedded down. So if you are focusing on LARP as an education piece, there is a lot of structure and work around that. If you're looking for it to be a nice to have, where you're doing your best to send a message to the players, like the Black Powder and Bloodlines example of, hey, like, this is a really unfair system. You can have them experience that lesson. You can have the message be doubled down on by NPCs and plot and whatever you want to do. But because your focus for the LARP is going to be the actual game and the event, it's not entirely up to you as to having full control over what lessons players learn from it or anything like that. If you want it to be a fully educational piece, then you'd need to add on extra components to actually have the feedback not be about the way the game was played, but be about the themes and the lessons learned and whatever else.
Cool. So we wanted to then move on, I guess. So did we want to go to which
Before
subject
we do,
did we
can I
want to
just
go to?
interject, Des?
Of course you
Matt.
can. Yeah.
Yeah, we should probably talk on education through games.
It's important to remember that when you are teaching, the most influential thing to help someone learn is guidance. There's a very basic model in education called the zone of proximal development. It's basically 3 circles within one another. The middle circle is, the student can do something on their own without any aid. And then the next bigger circle is they can do this with a bit of guidance. That middle circle there is the zone of proximal development. That's where they're going to learn the most and the fastest. And then the circle outside of that is something that's out of reach for them. If you put things in that circle when they're still in the middle, like right in the very center, they're not going to get in, and they're going to get sort of like what Joe was saying, where they're going to very quickly go through the answers until they get the right one. They might not be learning. They might just be cheating the system to try to progress through what they now see as barriers rather than what should be lessons. So I absolutely believe that you can teach life lessons through LARP, and I aim to do that all the time. But you do need to be careful of the guidance that you give them. You can't really just even though these are fully grown adults with fully grown minds, you can't always just let people go on their own. If there is an important lesson that you want to impart, you set your mechanics up. You need to set your story up to guide them along the way. It's almost a little bit railroady, so you need to be careful. But yeah, there are elements you can draw on. One of the most important things that I learned about placing objectives in a game is not just what that objective is, but where it's placed is also super important. And you can impart a lot of information with just the placement before they even get to see what that objective is. So in a video game, if you put a holograph tape in an abandoned room, you know that that's most probably going to be there for a long time, and it's going to be a diary of some sort before you even touch it, right? But if then it's yesterday's newspaper, you kind of thrown. It's like, oh, I thought this building was abandoned. You need that guidance. And so with careful design of your mechanics, you can very easily guide people to where you need them to go without it feeling like it's being railroaded.
And railroading
and I think
isn't necessarily the
ahead.
boogeyman that people make it out to be as well. The same as
not always,
power
no.
gaming and min-maxing and that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
It's a part of the hobby and it's a part of the game. Anything can be a problem if you take it to an extreme and do too much of it. But I think it's one of those things where it's a popular enough buzzword that people are able to go, oh, that's railroading, therefore equals bad.
Yeah, and I think as a writer or designer, you have to learn how best to exploit that element of the game without abusing it. You know what I mean? If that makes sense.
would it be fair to say that even though you can lead a horse to water, but you can't force the horse to drink, you still need to do the leading the horse part?
Yeah, you still need to set that up to give that horse the opportunity to drink, right?
And there's more than one way to lead the horse. You can specifically have the terrain sloping downwards to the water source. You can have water sources fucking everywhere. You don't have to... Leading the horse doesn't have to mean grabbing it by the snout. That's right, I said snout. Horse snout. Everyone's familiar with the term. Fucking dogs.
Too fucking right.
It's important to set things up correctly. And you can... I always use the term exploit because I feel like it's the best way to explain it. You're not abusing something, you're just finding the patterns in that thing that people may notice, and you just twist it just ever so slightly to your benefit as a storyteller, to guide someone where you need to go.
All right, Des, what was the next topic you wanted to move on to?
Okay, so is it possible to not worry about the rules and just play your own game, or are we going to move straight on to examples?
No, let's skip to examples.
Yeah, okay. So we'll take turns in giving examples of a game mechanic or rule and discuss how it affects roleplay, and we'll be able to sort of ask questions and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, and if you want to, absolutely give mechanics that you've had from your own games that you've written or been involved in.
Well, I might start off with one that's might be a bit controversial, and it's not combat related, but something that I've really enjoyed in Black Powder, and it's not necessarily a mechanic or rule. There is, if someone shows their character to be of higher status than your character, if you're within certain social environments, you have to obey them. Like they're in charge of you. You have to do what they say if you're a low status character. Because I deliberately made my character low status, so that meant that I was at the mercy of other high status characters. Because I'm lazy. If I have other players making my decisions for me, it means that I'm basically never run out of anything to do. Especially if as I did, make my character quite useful. Lots of people are going to want to tell me what to do lots of the time. Saves me effort. I don't need to figure out where I'm going. Someone will tell me where to go. Great. Then I just get to do role playing. So I think that's really good. But obviously, also if you enshrine that into if there is an actual so much because in Black Powder it's social consequences. Like if I, a commoner, refuse the orders of a nobleman, there's characters will get mad. But it's not there's no in-game punishment for that. But it's if you were to create something like that where it is a very strictly a mechanical rule of the game, that could create avenues for misuse or abuse by players. But I think there are lots of players who are I want to start playing this game, and I'm look, come play a low status character. It means you never have to figure out what the fuck you're doing because someone else will tell you what to do. You don't have to make your own choices. You can let another person do it for you, and you just you're along for the ride.
So Hayden, how is that mechanic communicated to the players?
So, and this is where
as an Uruk player, I don't have that at all. Yeah. That's not a mechanic I engage with. But for you, how is that the status mechanic communicated to the players by the designers?
So it's about sort of this implicit understanding of the way nobility, the way the sort of social hierarchy of aristocracy versus in this case, I don't know if I'm a serf necessarily, but my character is in the military, which is a organized hierarchy. There is basically no distinction between officers and aristocracy. So, as a member of the soldiery, it's it's within the sort of, because again, they haven't made it a mechanical rule per se. In the Black Powder, it's sort of in the setting of the world. This is the way characters are expected to behave in this society. But when you ask how is it communicated, because I feel like there are games where you could have a mechanic like this that was more sort of in the rules, but it would be very dependent on the way you communicate it, because you wouldn't want to include it in a way where it would be possible to misuse, because even if you set things up in the best possible way, people who want to misuse something like that will be drawn to its misuse. And I feel like there are some benefits to having something like that, or it could be interesting to play around with, but it's something where it's I feel like this would be fun to explore in a game that's sort of more about these kinds of relationships, but you wouldn't want it to sort of devolve.
In L5R, If a character of higher status in your clan tells you to do something, your choices are do it or kill yourself. Those are literally your two choices. But that's very clear in the system and in the setting. How is that different to the black powder method?
Well, it's still also a choice, I think, is the
Well, in the
important
black
thing.
powder method, the whole extra, like Charleston is the third choice. Like you rebel, you leave that social system, you enter a new social system, or in another character's case, you go to the bush. So you can escape. Like in the L5R example you give, like there's no, because I assume if a character chooses the third option, which is to escape that structure, everyone else is going to be like, "Whoa, you escaped the structure? Not on." Whereas in like,
they kill you and you have no honor.
yeah, and then whereas in like, you know, in because black powder's like an ugly world. If you choose to escape that structure, there are other options for you. Like no one's gone native yet, thank fucking god. But you know, like Charleston is always there. Like if you wanted, I know some players have escaped the social structure by switching nations, but still staying within that kind of social hierarchy. So they're still maybe a poor person, but they've changed their national allegiance. But yeah, I think there are like, because I like that structure sort of in terms of a gameplay sense. It makes it more interesting because most of my history of playing LARP characters has been as a higher status character, and that's a lot of effort and a lot of energy, and I was sort of like, I want to break from that. Which is something I've seen a lot of warband leaders do. But it's like having a game where you take that from a choice that players are making, so it's like, you can choose to engage in this social hierarchy, and instead making it where it's like, yeah, pick one of these two groups to be in, one group tells the other group what to do. There could be stuff to explore with that, and it could be interesting. But again, you'd want to make sure that it's not something that players are misusing.
Yeah. So specifically, I think Joe's question is, as Avi has pointed out, is it written in the rules or is it communicated by the setting, culture, and example?
It's not a rule. And as I'm saying, it's not a rule in Black Powder. I think if you made a game where it was a rule, that could be interesting, and I would like to see that, or even do it myself, like play around with that.
Yeah. So I guess, just bouncing off of Hayden's example, I play Black Powder and Bloodlines as well, and as everyone probably knows, I play a surgeon, and the roleplay that I have communicated to other players is that my surgeon is high class, university trained, and therefore a very, very good surgeon. However, the mechanics of the game do not dictate that the healing that I do is any better or worse than any other doctor in the game. However, I have had instances where the players will ask for my character very specifically because they feel that the story of the education is something that they trust in, and it's not written in the rules that because I have given myself importance, therefore I have it. It's more that it has been something that has been communicated by the setting of the culture, and it's also a social contract because we were already in the game world, like under a harsh social contract, due to class structure and how we perceive wealth in game. That it has then become a symptom of people engaging with my character as if she has a lot more authority in being a surgeon, thus will turn to her and say, oh, we must have a university educated surgeon, of course. And it's like, mechanically, it will do the same thing if you ask the guy next to me, and it'll be fine. But it's interesting that part of that world building has become part of the world mechanics, or the game mechanics. And therefore, as Josiah has pointed out, it has player-driven stuff often, and the social hierarchy in the game is in the game's manual world description.
Player-driven content and the way they react to stuff is always going to be the most important part of how your game plays, no matter what. It's just about supporting them and giving them the options and the information they need to be able to do that to the best of their abilities, I think. I might go next with an example of a rule or mechanic. So one of the ones that I put in at the Warsong was sort of a bit of an overhaul to get things more consistent across the board, between the weekly, almost more battle game type nights and the big like town structure out in the wilderness, NPCs and story type weekenders. And that is our rules for non-combatants. And a big part of that is also one of the guiding principles of the Warsong was about accessibility and giving all players in the community the support to play what they wanted to play. So obviously non-combatant, you want to mark them out with a sash so that you've got a visible icon of who is and isn't. But we specifically wanted the non-combatants to be able to play in all of the events, including combat. So having the sash essentially meant that you wouldn't physically hit them and they wouldn't physically hit you, but they were still able to deliver coup de grace to downed players. They were still able to heal. They were still able to cast magic using the roleplay magic system. And they being killed was basically mirrored the coup de grace system. So instead of a 3-second role play of including the words coup de grace of you demonstrating that you are finishing off a downed, wounded opponent, it was 3 seconds of role play including the words you are slain to down an otherwise active non-combatant. And then that would drop them to 0 hit points, and then coup de grace and all the rest of the healing, and the rules would remain exactly the same for non-combatants than it does for other characters once they're in the downed state, which is one of the things that really helps if you have conditions in your glossary, in your mechanics and your rules. You can actually make them consistent across the whole thing. You don't have to spell out when a character is at 0 hit points or keep coming up with synonyms. They are downed. Everyone knows what that means. You can refer to it in multiple places if need be. But the bit that I really liked about it was it meant that when we started having some of those safety type issues at the town events of what if combat spills into the town and you're fighting around guy ropes and tents, or people want to fight inside structures and that sort of stuff, and we're actually making the decision that we don't want that to happen because it's unsafe, instead of it being this is a magic box where no combat can happen, we were able to say this is a non-combatant area, not in the you can't do combat sense, but by the definition of the rules. So now everyone within the town space or within 2 meters of the structures or guy ropes is using the same combat mechanics that apply as if you were wearing a sash. So you can still kill people if they run away from you. They can't play schoolyard barley rules of I'm in town, you can't hurt me. As soon as they cross that line, you demonstrate with your weapon, you role play for 3 seconds, you drop them to 0 hit points, and then if you're trying to kill them as opposed to capture them or whatever else, you can coup de grace them as well. And then that sort of supported the social contract of if you don't want people fighting and killing in town, that's now an in-game responsibility of the players to decide as characters, maybe we should do up a treaty or a truce. Maybe we should actually have, and what ended up happening was a town guard guild that drew from different warbands to actually enforce making sure people weren't walking around brandishing weapons in town. If you see someone slay someone or try to coup de grace someone in town, you actually try to get them arrested or you step in, instead of it being having the rules be a strict, we want this to be a peaceful town, therefore it's impossible to hurt anyone in town. We moved to the non-combat system so that combat wasn't as running around and frenetic and a safety issue, but it didn't take away the ability to resolve conflict, and it didn't put a hard barrier of combat area, like social only area or whatever.
So, Rick, if you and I are in town together,
yep,
and I decide that you've offended me,
mm-hmm.
can I draw my dagger and say, blah, 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 you are slain, and down you go?
Yep.
Or, okay. Can non-combatants do that on the field?
On field, no.
Okay.
So purely as a balancing thing, because in general combat on the field
takes more than 3 seconds to squish someone.
Yeah, everyone's using the full hit point system and everything else. You don't want to take away someone's ability to dodge or parry by having it just be you're within range. I pointed my weapon at you first, you are slain. But in the town environment, at least, because everyone's now playing by those rules, it becomes balanced.
Does it mean that me in my corset and long dress can take out the knight in full armor with polearm?
Yep.
Cool. Right.
And
I understand that. Is that okay?
I think so. I think when you're looking at the purpose of it, you almost want it to be like the reason it's not just killing them, it's dropping them to a down state. Is it's almost that if you are in town and your guard is lowered, it's a lot easier to get someone with a cheap shot or take them down, or it allows you to poison someone's drink with you are slain, or use magic or something to knock them out. But then you're also, if you want to actually kill them, it's going to be quite obvious that you're now trying to murder this downed person or whatever else. But the interesting bit for me as one of those, when you get to the player feedback part of it, the people that complained that it wasn't balanced were actually the ones that were trying to do I want to gank the guy with the polearm in the full plate. Because what you find is if people are actively defending themselves and in that mistrustful position, the guy standing with his polearm extended has 3 meters worth of being able to say you are slain before you with your dagger and no armor can actually get to the stage where you can realistically threaten him. But if 2 or 3 people with daggers want to take him down, by the time he has slain the first one, your co-conspirators are able to take him down. So it gives you the ability to not just say, well, there's no point, I'm just going to die, or I can go on a rampage and kill everybody, but you're still able to have conflict and you're still able to defend yourself. It's not a one-for-one representation of how the combat works out on the battlefield, but it allows for enough of that without also having it's not safe for people to be swinging polearms in tents and whatever else.
What about ranged weapons?
That's the interesting one. For me, that was the bit that I wasn't 100% happy with and would have continued to keep tweaking. So, again, because it was a safety type thing, the official ruling we went with was you point the ranged weapon, and if they were at not the minimum safe distance, but effectively it's that realistic range, but not at the point where you're getting into arguments of, I don't think you could have made that shot type thing. Like it's more of a cheap shot execution type thing. So it's at the short end of the range, depending on the weapon. You don't actually fire the weapon. And because of the way that we trained our players with band guns and bows and everything else, you don't point a loaded weapon at someone unless you plan on shooting them. The interesting discussion around it ended up falling on the side of your weapon should not be loaded when you point it at someone to slay them. So that was the one where it was a bit more contentious, because it's then, from a balance perspective, if they don't have to reload, does that mean that it's more overpowered and all the rest of it? But if it's only at, say, 5 meters range, then it's still just a slightly longer polearm, and you still have to role-play the full 3 seconds of you are slain to take down the first guy, in which case everyone can either run away or draw their weapons and get to you first. So generally, unless you have backup and you're trying to roll through town specifically to do a raid or kill a bunch of people or whatever, similar to Hayden when talking about the Western shootout. Whoever shoots first, you'll get the first person that you tried to take out, but it will probably be a daisy chain of revenge behind you, and you will also be one of the people that dies. Unless you roleplay well enough to convince people, hey, I have a valid grievance, I'm only going to go take this one guy out, then I'll leave town and please don't come after me. Bribe the town guard.
Yeah. Does Matt? Would you like to go next?
In terms of a mechanic that we use in our LARP.
Yeah. So, or it doesn't have to be your LARP. It can be any LARP. But yeah, give an example of a game mechanic overall that, and discuss how it affects roleplay.
Well, I'll use one that's in our LARP, even though I didn't write the rule set. We're using Vampire the Masquerade, Mind's Eye Theatre, but we use a character sheet with traits, and one of the things is that we have contested traits. So you bid your traits, and those can be the keyword abilities. Like I am beguiling and charismatic as, you know, two of my traits, and you can go up to 5 in those traits. And so you would go into a scene with someone else and bid those traits. It's like, I'm going to bid my beguiling traits. I have 3 of those. And I'm going to try to use that beauty to convince you that you should help me with this thing that I want done. And they would then have to bid up to an equal amount of traits in a similar set of traits that would counteract that. If they can't, you easily win because you've bid more traits. If they can, you go to rock, paper, scissors. So we don't have combat, it's entirely social. But that trait system, and there's also negative traits that you can bid, which gets really fun, because if, you know, at character creation, you take a couple of negative traits, and if I've worked out through this that, hey, you may have crazy bitch as a negative trait, I can say, oh, I know you've got that negative trait, so now you're down a trait in this contest, sort of thing, because I can use my persuasion to get around that sort of thing. It creates in-game a social chain, a social hierarchy. You know that those Toreadors over there, you're probably going to want to get those when you want someone to be really either intimidating or really persuasive for this thing. But you're probably going to want to get the Bruja if you need to go in and kick the cop's ass. So you create, this social hierarchy of needs and abilities that are useful to the players, which also creates a whole bunch of social interaction and a need to work with clans that aren't your own. So, like, for example, one of the most powerful combinations that I see all the time is Toreadors and Nosferatus working together. Because Toreadors are the pretty, but Nosferatu are hideous, ugly, but they have high-tech abilities and lots of underground stealth. And that can set up in storyteller scenes a 2-pronged attack that, like, is really, really useful, really powerful. But there's this built-in mechanic in the way the clans work, is that they don't actually like each other. So you have to have the characters find a reason to get past that, to work with one another. So I really like the way it builds those social interactions simply from the mechanics, simply from the world building and from the trait system. You can't have, you couldn't have, say, like a Gangrel, who is a very bestial, have a lot of beautiful traits to go up against Toreadors, because they can't, for one, like, some of them they can't take, but also there's just a limit to what you can take. And if you're building a bestial character to be beautiful, you're completely building off course, and you're not going to get any of your clan-based stuff that you need strong. So yeah, it builds this social hierarchy of needs, and it forces people to be social and to interact and to work together to get things done, despite all of the negatives that exist in the world and between the clans, which I think is really interesting. So we don't, our combat is literally bidding traits and then rock, paper, scissors on ties. But it's very social and very intriguing in that regard. That's one of the reasons I wanted to run it, is because, you know, I came from a LARP that was meant to be, you know, really heavy on RP, but became a battle LARP just because it got bigger and bigger. And it just, with that many players, it became hard to RP and have it make a difference, where it was easier to just grab 40 people and go raid that camp. So I liked the social interaction, and that's why I wanted to run that game. So yeah, I think it's a really good example of using the mechanics to get what you want out of your players, just from a world building and mechanics standpoint.
Just
Matt,
quickly.
Des,
go ahead, Rick.
I just wanted to clarify with those traits. I think the way that you mentioned it was that other players have to learn which traits, so it's not like a publicly known thing who's got what straight out of the gate.
Yes, those traits are known only to yourself, especially in negative traits. And you don't. The whole idea is you want to try to keep those negative traits hidden from other players, but you still have to roleplay them. So yeah,
I think that's one of the things that leads to those really interesting possibilities where you can have what would be seen as the min-max version of you build what is the best combination based on your clan and based on the way that you want to play. But you can also have people that are specifically role-playing that deception angle of trying to convince people that they are what they're not, or trying to break the mold even if it's not as efficient or effective based on what the stereotype would have been.
Yeah, and we have a couple of players in our game who are playing as though they're almost from different clans, but it's just because of the way they've built their character. So we have one of the stereotypical Toreador type of things is, you know, very up themselves, high class etiquette. You know, I know better than you because I'm prettier than you and I have more money and power than you. But we have one character who's playing a full-on empath build, which is amazing to me because they, you know, every other Toreador tries to be intimidating and this person just comes over and just tells you what you're thinking and you immediately trust them instead of wanting to, you know, butt heads because they're higher class. You're just like, oh, I like this person immediately. It's a really interesting build, and that's built into the character, but no one ever uses it. So I thought that was really, really cool.
So the competitive, when you're competing with somebody else on the traits, is that baked into the rule system which traits you're allowed to use? Or is it just, I have to, if you say beguiling, I have to be like, well, I think my strong will counters that or whatever. Do you just like pick, or is it baked in?
It's not really all that heavily baked in. It's mostly every term has a definition. And it'll give examples. You know, you'll use this if you want to dodge. You'll use athletics if you really need to like dodge a bullet, but you'll use dodge if you need to dodge a melee hit. In that way, it's sort of baked in, but for the most part, it comes down to how do you define the word? Are you using a slightly different definition to what's written there? And as long as we agree that, yeah, that's a correct definition and you can play it that way, then you can totally play it that way. And you can use competing abilities in interesting and different ways, probably separate to how it was originally intended, but that's all a part of the intrigue for me as well, is finding new ways to get around puzzles. Yeah.
Just quickly, off of the back of what you mentioned very, very briefly, but I think can kind of get away from people sometimes, is a numbers cap as a mechanic. I know that a game sort of making you feel like you have less impact on the world because of how big it is. Obviously, that can be a design aspect in some regard, in that, like, if you are a part of a big game, it can feel like you're like a part of a fabric of a world and that you're just sort of like in the soup. So I've definitely had really positive experiences with like a large game. However, yeah, there is definitely merits to making something small, not only because if you want to make sure that you're not biting off too much of what you can chew, that you're sort of negotiating maybe more intimate storylines with a smaller group of players, then that will be definitely much more beneficial to you.
We have a character. We have a player cap of 30 at the moment. And that's down to a few things. Like, one is the limitation of the location. It's a small room and it's a licensed room, like alcohol license, so that they have a capacity limit. There are only 2 of us running the game, and we've not had to look for new people to help with that because we've only had a maximum of 22 players come to a game anyway, and we can handle that ourselves. And because we both work together, like next, desks 5 meters apart, we can just turn to one another during the day at work, and be like, "Hey, how about this?" And it's much easier for us to work with that. But the other reason, realistically, that we wanted to keep it low was because we wanted to tell stories that felt important to each individual player, and we find that that's really hard to do with large numbers. We don't get to give people their moment, their 15 minutes of glory. You know what I mean? In much the same way, I would personally like to keep a classroom capped to 20 students. I want to keep our game capped to about 30 people. We've discussed going up to 40 if we ever need to, but realistically, we want to keep it low so that we can keep that engagement up for everyone and have it flow really, really nicely.
It's almost as you were talking about the players with godlike power example earlier as well. If your game is about a few gods, then you need to think about that when you put in player caps and that sort of thing, so that you actually have the dozen gods of the pantheon represented as all of the players, as opposed to 150 players all playing gods with overlap on all their domains, and now no one gets the hero moment because there's no one able to provide plot to 150 players.
Well,
if you want to feel
overlap,
if you want to feel like a soldier in a large scale battle, then that's the perfect type of story to tell in a large scale LARP. If you want to be the hobbits trying to take the ring to Mordor, you can't really have more than 10 hobbits before that starts to really cut down on roleplay potential and cohesive story.
Yeah, and I think if we were using gods as an example, which is a bit silly, but we'll use it anyway. If we have 150 gods, there either is going to be overlap in abilities, or everyone is going to be so unique that it's going to be fucking impossible for everyone to remember what each other person can do.
Yeah, well, I think there's something to be said about like the scale of impact, because like I've played one of those god characters in a game like as an NPC, and I found that sort of doing that coming from like basically it made me functionally invulnerable within the game, and that changed the way I was treated by people I knew out of character, and it changed the way I was able to behave, because I chose to take that character in a direction that was like leaning hard into some of my own neuroses, because I was like, oh cool, I get to like question a lot of things that people take for granted, and like no one can lash out at me because of that, because I'll destroy them. But it's also like, because I had a reputation, like as I mentioned earlier, for being like ruthlessly competitive, like that put a lot of my decisions as a character into question. And suddenly, like, this is in a game of like, because I'd gone in a game of like 500, 600 people from being a person who was in charge of like maybe 15 individuals, then with a bunch of political influence, to instead being someone with no direct control over anyone, but I had, this sort of like invulnerability on the battlefield and one hit kill. And like, so there was still a similar scale of impact, but then it's like, someone who's neither of those things and it's just like an ordinary soldier is like, yeah, there's like far less scale of impact for them, and the kind of story or things they can get away with or do are very different. And it's similar with, with the Hobbit's Hoedown when we were looking at numbers, like because we want it to feel like a family environment. It's hard to feel like that if you don't at least have a passing knowledge of who everyone is. Like if you've got complete strangers who you don't interact with all weekend, it's like it doesn't feel like a family reunion. That feels like a town fair, which is fine, but it's like fundamentally different from what
Hobbit's Burning Man.
yeah it's exactly, and it's like feels different from what the game is going for. And I think that's worth looking at for your own game if you're designing one. Is it's like, what kind of stories do you want people telling? Do you want people to be like salt of the earth, like they're not going to have a big impact, but that's okay. We're here to tell those small, intimate stories. Maybe like there are huge numbers of people, but like that's all right. Like that's part of the game feel that you want, is having people be like, there are so many strangers, I can't interact with everyone, and that's fine. Or do you want a game where it's like everyone's story matters, everyone is important, everyone knows who everyone else is because they're all important like components in this story that is being told. And that is one of the most important questions you'll have to answer about your game, because if you take two identical rule sets and then you like have one scaled to 30 people and one scaled to like 500, they're so different because the scale of impact each individual is going to have, it will be vastly different. Like in a battle game of 30 players, I don't really have to worry about working in a team so much, because if I kill 3 people and then die, I've killed like, of the enemy team of 15 players, I've killed a fifth of them, and that's huge. But if I do that in a game of 500, if I go off on my own, kill 3 people, like I've reduced the enemy team's number from 250 to 247. That's nothing. That doesn't mean anything. And so like working on your own is massively disincentivized. And so it's like, yeah, I think looking at the sort of scale of impact an individual has is something that you'll want to take into account when you decide on the numbers, because it's like, how much power do you want players to feel like they have over this like game that you're doing? Like, how much influence do you want them to feel like they have? Because it will change the way players interact, and especially if you also, like the situation I was in, if one player has a huge scale of impact on an individual level and then most players have like way less, that is going to affect the game as well. And it's something you need to take into account, because like, the time I spent playing that sort of godlike character was very difficult, and I had a good time and I also had a very bad time doing it.
Also, if you're looking at that, what you want your the impact and the capability and the type of characters that your players can be, that's really important to make sure that when you're circling back and doing your reviews, do the mechanics actually support the characters being able to do in the game the stuff that you think it's important that they can do in the setting? Or have you accidentally made a game where everyone's more impressive in their backstory than they, like cinematics and cutscenes are epic, and then everyone's just poking each other with daggers until they fall down because there's no flavor or grandeur or drama to the mechanics. I think Joe was tight for time. Did you want to jump in with anything before we wrap up, Joe?
No, I think we've had a really good discussion. I don't think I've got enough time to do another deep dive into a mechanic. So what do we need to do to wrap up?
Sorry. I guess what I'll say is that thanks for everyone for tuning in, and also thank you to all of our panelists for bearing with us, and also pitching in for this discussion. It's been highly enlightening, and I really appreciate all of your expertise. Yeah. So that being said, the next subject that we're going to be doing is Ludo narrative and game feel. And I believe that Hayden has a lot of things to say on this, and we'll have Jack on from Ukyo Melon to say some things as well. And I will put it out as soon as we sort of figure out when we're actually going to be doing it. But yeah, ludonarrative and game feel is super important if you're going to be doing a supremely artsy-fartsy kind of game, I think. Or even if you're not, it's still going to be interesting to sort of think about with any game that you design.
Yeah.
But yeah, other than that, does anyone else have any sort of like maybe short little tidbits that they want to say, like a sentence worth of nugget of wisdom in terms of mechanic and game?
Material outcomes will be the most important thing. You need to think about what they're going to be, and once they've happened, you need to look at them in depth. Always focus on material outcomes. Material dialectics are the way forward. Sorry, my cat yelled at everyone for not being raw chicken.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll just circle back around to making sure you really dig into why, like whether it's why players are playing in a certain way, whether it is why you actually want that rule to be in there, and then connecting those dots to figure out, is it the best rule or mechanic to give you that outcome, or is it just a communication piece where you just need to explain to the players that this was the in-game justification for it so that you get that sort of reaction that you're looking for? Or is it just a bad rule and you need to scrap it and start again?
I'll say that when it comes to your mechanics, if you phrase them as though they are a question that needs an answer, you'll get much more enlightened responses from your players. And that when you have a good question, it needs to be both properly scaffolded and open-ended.
Think about the lessons that your mechanics teach your players and make sure that what your mechanics are doing and the gameplay your mechanics are encouraging is the gameplay that you actually want from your players. Also, thanks chat, thanks mods, you guys are great.
Thank you. I guess for me, I'll say as one of those artsy-fartsy game writers, think about how you want your players to feel it, and how you want them to interact with each other, and really try to be conscious of the culture of the game that you are creating for your player base. Cool. Well, I guess that's about it. Thank you to everyone who tuned in, and I hope this was helpful. And thank you to everyone on the panel. If you're in Sydney, I believe, look up Matt's LARP, Coram Purim, I think. Is that how it's pronounced?
Yeah, Coram Purim.
Yeah. And then, I mean, Vampire the Masquerade, who doesn't love it? Love to see it. Anyways, thank you very much, and we'll see you at the next one.
Yeah.
Combat isn't the only mechanics. Player character creation isn't the only mechanics. You need more.
Remember to global horizontal organization, radicalize your family members, radicalize your friends.
Join a union.
Yep, join a union. Bernie dropped out. It's a dark time. The apparatus of capital must be destroyed. Have a great one, everyone. Thanks for tuning in.
Don't fall to despair.
Kill Hitler.